Hey there, welcome to Broaderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Dark basement. Have you ever felt an eerie presence in a place you thought was safe? Something lurking just beyond the periphery of your vision, a whisper of fear brushing against your spine? As I stood in the dimly lit basement of my family's old house, the air was thick with dust and the musty smell of forgotten memories. It was a Saturday morning, and I had decided to finally tackle the home renovation project that had been long overdue. The peeling wallpaper and creaking floorboards were nothing compared to the unsettling feeling I often had down there. With each stroke of the paintbrush, I could feel the weight of time pressing down on me. This house had seen generations of laughter and tears, and while it had its charm, there was an unsettling history that seemed to cling to the walls. I often found myself imagining the lives of those who had come before me. Did they hear the same whispers? Feel the same cold draft that seemed to crawl up from the depths of the basement? As I worked, I noticed a section of the floor that looked slightly different, darker, almost worn. My curiosity piqued. I grabbed a crowbar from the toolbox and began prying up the boards. The sound of wood splitting echoed around the basement, a cacophony that felt oddly amplified in the stillness. With each board I removed, the air grew colder, as if the very essence of the house was being disturbed. Finally, I uncovered a trapdoor hidden beneath layers of dust and debris. My heart raced with both excitement and trepidation. I hesitated for a moment, glancing around the dim room, half expecting someone or something to jump out at me. But the silence was suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and lifted the trapdoor. A set of rickety wooden stairs descended into darkness. The smell of damp earth wafted up, a mix of mold and something else I couldn't quite place. I grabbed a flashlight and, against my better judgment, began my descent. As I stepped onto the first stair, I felt a shiver race down my spine. The sound of my footsteps echoed ominously in the cramped space, amplifying my sense of isolation. I paused halfway down, the beam of my flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. What was I doing? I had always been the curious type, but this was different. It felt wrong. Yet the urge to uncover what lay below was overpowering. I continued down, each step deeper into the unknown. At the bottom of the stairs, the passage opened up into a cavernous room. My flashlight beam flickered across the walls, revealing strange symbols carved into the stone. They looked ancient, otherworldly, as if they had been there long before my family ever moved into the house. My heart pounded in my chest. Was I truly alone down here? Suddenly, I heard a low, guttural sound echoing from the far corner of the room. It felt as if the darkness itself had come alive, wrapping around me like a shroud. I swung my flashlight in the direction of the noise, but the beam of light only revealed more symbols and shadows dancing on the walls. Fear surged through me, and for a moment, I considered turning back. But the mystery pulled me deeper. I took a cautious step forward, the floor damp beneath my feet. As I moved further in, the air became colder, and the unsettling noise grew louder, a whispering, like voices carrying secrets I was not meant to hear. What is this place? I whispered to myself, the words barely escaping my lips. My voice sounded foreign in the oppressive silence. The whispers seemed to respond, swirling around me, each syllable sending a chill down my spine. I felt a sudden compulsion to touch the symbols, to understand what they meant. As my fingers brushed against the cold stone, a jolt of energy surged through me. I yanked my hand back, heart racing, and the whispers turned into a cacophony of disjointed words and phrases. I couldn't make sense of them, but one thing was clear: I had stumbled upon something ancient and terrifying. In that moment, I realized I was not just exploring a hidden space in my home. I had unwittingly opened a door to something far darker than I could have ever imagined. The house had its secrets, and now I was entwined with them. Suddenly, the whispers grew silent, replaced by a heavy stillness that pressed down on me. I glanced around, the shadows in the corners of the room seeming to stretch and shift, as if alive. My heart pounded louder than ever, echoing in the silence, and I felt an overwhelming urge to flee. But the pull of the passage was too strong, and as the last echoes of sound faded, I felt an inexplicable connection to the darkness surrounding me. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would unravel the very fabric of my reality. The stillness around me was deafening, and as I stood there, heart racing, I felt an inexplicable urge to explore further. The fear of what I might find battled with an insatiable curiosity that tugged at my mind. What had I uncovered? The symbols, the whispers, they felt like pieces of a puzzle I was destined to solve. Gathering my courage, I pushed deeper into the room. My flashlight flickered as I walked, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. The air grew heavier with each step, charged with a strange energy that sent goosebumps prickling across my skin. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking just beyond the reach of my light. I approached the far wall, where the symbols were etched in what appeared to be a strange, dark substance, almost like dry blood. As I leaned in closer, the whispers returned, more pronounced now, coiling around me like tendrils. "Leave, go back," they hissed, their urgency sending a fresh wave of fear coursing through me. But I was too entranced to heed their warning. My fingers traced the symbols, each one more intricate than the last. They spoke of ancient rituals, of beings that dwelled in darkness and shadows. One symbol, in particular, seemed to pulse beneath my fingertips, resonating with an energy that was both alluring and repulsive. It felt alive. Suddenly, the ground beneath me shifted, and I stumbled back. A low rumble echoed from deep within the passage. I could feel vibrations through the soles of my shoes, a warning that reverberated in my bones. Panic surged through me, the instinct to flee became overwhelming. I turned to retreat, but something stopped me. A glimmer caught my eye. In the center of the room stood a small altar, partially obscured by shadows. Drawn in by a force I couldn't comprehend, I approached it, each step fueled by a mixture of dread and curiosity. The altar was carved from a dark stone, smooth and cool to the touch. Atop it lay an object wrapped in tattered fabric, pulsating faintly as if it contained a heartbeat. With trembling hands, I reached out and peeled back the fabric. My breath caught in my throat. It was a mirror, but not just any mirror. The surface rippled like water, reflecting not my own image, but a dark void filled with swirling shadows. I leaned closer, mesmerized by its depths, as if it were calling to me. Then, an image flickered across the surface, a fleeting glimpse of a place that was familiar yet otherworldly. My childhood home, but twisted, darkened. Windows barred with iron, the air thick with dread. I recoiled, heart racing, but the mirror held me captive, drawing me in deeper. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence, low and seductive. "You wish to see what lies beyond," it murmured. The voice wrapped around me, coaxing me closer to the mirror's edge. I felt my will wavering, as if the very essence of the darkness was reaching out to envelop me. "No," I gasped, forcing myself to step back. The whispers intensified, echoing my thoughts, urging me to succumb to the allure of the unknown. "Stay. Join us," they chorused, weaving through the air like a sinister lullaby. I stumbled away from the altar, my heart pounding violently against my chest. The walls seemed to close in around me, shadows stretching, clawing for my attention. I turned, desperate to escape the claustrophobic grip of the room, but the way back felt altered, distorted. The familiar path I had taken moments ago was now an endless maze of shifting darkness. I fought against the rising panic. "Think," I urged myself. "You have to find a way out." My flashlight flickered again, casting erratic beams of light, and I scanned the walls, searching for a clue, anything to guide me back. The symbols seemed to taunt me now, their meanings slipping further from my grasp. Then, a chilling thought crept into my mind. What if the whispers were right? What if I was meant to stay here, drawn into this otherworldly realm? The very idea sent a shiver down my spine, and I shook my head, trying to dispel the thoughts. With a sudden surge of determination, I turned toward the nearest wall, hoping to find an exit. My heart raced as I pressed against it, feeling the rough stone beneath my palms. And then, I noticed something, a faint light flickering in the distance, beyond the shadows. Instinct kicked in, and I sprinted toward it, adrenaline pushing me forward. The light grew brighter, illuminating a narrow passage that cut through the darkness. As I ran, the whispers faded into the background, replaced by the sound of my own frantic breaths. I burst into the passage, the cold air hitting me like a wave. The walls were lined with more symbols, and the atmosphere shifted. It felt alive, pulsing with an energy that was both intoxicating and terrifying. The light ahead flickered like a distant star, and I focused on it, desperate to reach safety. As I approached, I noticed a doorway at the end of the passage, the light spilling through its cracks. Hope surged within me, and I pushed myself to run faster. But as I reached the door, I felt an icy hand grasp my shoulder, pulling me back. I turned, my heart sinking. The shadows were alive now, swirling around me, their forms coalescing into indistinct shapes, faces twisted in silent screams. Panic flooded my mind. I was not alone. The voices returned, louder and more frantic than ever. "Join us, forever." With a surge of instinct, I yanked myself free and flung open the door. Light flooded my vision, blinding me momentarily. I stumbled through, not knowing what lay ahead, but feeling an overwhelming need to escape the shadows that chased me. What I found on the other side was beyond my wildest fears, a reality I could never have prepared for. I stumbled through the doorway, the brightness enveloping me like a warm blanket. But as my eyes adjusted, the comfort quickly dissipated. I found myself in a room that felt both familiar and utterly foreign. It was a distorted version of my childhood home, walls painted in cheerful colors, yet shadows clung to every corner, twisting the light into grotesque shapes. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and the silence felt heavy, as if the very essence of the house was holding its breath. I stepped forward, my heart pounding, scanning the space for any sign of normalcy. But the familiar layout was corrupted, every room feeling like a twisted echo of the life I had known. As I moved deeper into the house, I noticed photographs hanging on the walls, familiar faces staring back at me, their smiles warped and twisted, as if something dark lingered just beneath the surface. My family, my friends, all of them seemed to be trapped in this otherworldly reflection, their eyes pleading for help. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. "Get out!" I shouted, my voice cracking in the eerie stillness. But there was no response, only the echo of my own words bouncing back at me, hollow and empty. Panic clawed at my throat, urging me to flee. I turned to leave, but the hallway stretched endlessly before me, twisting and turning into a maze. The walls seemed to shift, closing in around me as if the house itself was alive, trapping me within its dark embrace. I could feel it, something malevolent lurking just beyond my sight, watching, waiting. With trembling hands, I pressed against the walls, searching for a way out. I stumbled into the living room, the familiar couch and coffee table positioned as they had been, but the room felt suffocated, weighed down by an unseen presence. I could see a reflection in the window, a flicker of movement behind me. I whipped around, but nothing was there. Just shadows shifting. "Stop it!" I yelled, frustration mingling with fear. But the shadows only deepened, darkening the corners of the room. It felt like a game, one I was ill-equipped to play. I needed to find a way back, to escape this place that twisted my reality. Just then, a faint sound broke through the silence, a soft, childlike giggle echoing from the kitchen. My heart skipped a beat. It was my sister, Emily's laugh. I hadn't heard that sound in years. Curiosity pierced through my fear, and I moved toward the sound, drawn like a moth to a flame. As I stepped into the kitchen, the light flickered. I found her sitting at the table, a porcelain doll in her hands. The doll was eerily lifelike, its eyes glinting with a malevolent intelligence. "Emily?" I called out, my voice trembling. She looked up, and I felt a jolt of recognition mixed with horror. Her face was the same, yet it was twisted by something dark. "Come play with me," she said, her voice sweet yet chilling. "We can have so much fun." "Where are we?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The kitchen was filled with the smell of something rotten, the sunlight casting eerie shadows across her face. Emily's smile faded, replaced by an expression I had never seen before, something like hunger or perhaps longing. "You shouldn't have come here. It's dangerous." Her voice lowered to a whisper, and she leaned in closer, the doll's gaze fixed on me. "But you can stay. We can be together." Panic surged anew. "No. I need to leave." I stepped back, but the shadows in the room shifted, creeping closer, their whispers growing louder. "Join us," they chanted in a haunting melody that sent chills down my spine. "I can't," I shouted, desperately searching for a way out. "You're not real." Emily's expression hardened, and in that moment, I saw the darkness lurking behind her eyes. "You're wrong," she said, her voice twisting into something sinister. "We're all real here. And we're waiting for you." Before I could react, the shadows lunged at me, their forms coiling and writhing. I turned and fled, the laughter echoing behind me, mocking my fear. The hallway stretched again, warping in a way that made my stomach churn. I dashed back toward the doorway I had come through, but it was gone, replaced by a wall of pulsating darkness. My breath quickened, panic clawing at my throat. The whispers filled the air, drowning out my thoughts. "You can't escape. You belong to us now." In a final desperate attempt, I turned and charged toward the nearest window, slamming my palms against the glass. The reflections warped, revealing the outside world, a chaotic swirl of colors and shapes, like a painting gone awry. The normalcy I craved felt just out of reach. As I pushed harder, the glass splintered, shards flying everywhere. I felt a rush of hope. If I could break through, I could escape. I could. Suddenly, something icy gripped my ankle, yanking me back. I fell to the floor, my heart racing as I looked up to see shadows closing in, their forms twisting and writhing, seeking to claim me. "Help!" I screamed, desperation flooding my voice. The shadows loomed closer, their whispers echoing in my mind, urging me to surrender. Just when I thought all hope was lost, a flash of light illuminated the room. I blinked, disoriented, and saw a figure standing in the doorway, tall, dark, and undeniably powerful. The light radiated from them, pushing the shadows back, forcing them to retreat. "Run," the figure commanded, their voice a deep echo that resonated within me. Without hesitation, I scrambled to my feet and darted past the figure, the light creating a safe path through the encroaching darkness. I could hear the whispers fading, the shadows retreating, but I didn't stop to look back. I had to escape. As I burst through another door, I found myself in a long, narrow hallway, the light guiding me forward. But ahead, I could see something looming, an archway filled with swirling mist, beckoning me to cross. It felt like a threshold between worlds, a chance to reclaim my reality. But was it truly a way out, or another trap waiting to ensnare me? With a glance over my shoulder, I saw the figure standing guard against the shadows, their presence a comforting reminder of hope. I took a deep breath, knowing I had to take the leap to embrace whatever lay beyond. I stepped through the archway, the mist enveloping me. As I crossed the threshold, I felt a surge of energy, and everything went dark. I awoke in darkness, the air around me thick and suffocating. My head throbbed, and it took a moment for me to remember where I was, or rather, where I had been. The swirling mist, the figure of light, the shadows, it all felt distant now, like a fading nightmare. But as I stood and glanced around, reality settled in with a crushing weight. I wasn't free. "Stop it!" I yelled, frustration mingling with fear. But the shadows only deepened, darkening the corners of the room. It felt like a game, one I was ill-equipped to play. I needed to find a way back, to escape this place that twisted my reality. Just then, a faint sound broke through the silence, a soft, childlike giggle echoing from the kitchen. My heart skipped a beat. It was my sister, Emily's laugh. I hadn't heard that sound in years. Curiosity pierced through my fear, and I moved toward the sound, drawn like a moth to a flame. As I stepped into the kitchen, the light flickered. I found her sitting at the table, a porcelain doll in her hands. The doll was eerily lifelike, its eyes glinting with a malevolent intelligence. "Emily?" I called out, my voice trembling. She looked up, and I felt a jolt of recognition mixed with horror. Her face was the same, yet it was twisted by something dark. "Come play with me," she said, her voice sweet yet chilling. "We can have so much fun." "Where are we?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The kitchen was filled with the smell of something rotten, the sunlight casting eerie shadows across her face. Emily's smile faded, replaced by an expression I had never seen before, something like hunger or perhaps longing. "You shouldn't have come here. It's dangerous." Her voice lowered to a whisper, and she leaned in closer, the doll's gaze fixed on me. "But you can stay. We can be together." Panic surged anew. "No. I need to leave." I stepped back, but the shadows in the room shifted, creeping closer, their whispers growing louder. "Join us," they chanted in a haunting melody that sent chills down my spine. "I can't," I shouted, desperately searching for a way out. "You're not real." Emily's expression hardened, and in that moment, I saw the darkness lurking behind her eyes. "You're wrong," she said, her voice twisting into something sinister. "We're all real here, and we're waiting for you." Before I could react, the shadows lunged at me, their forms coiling and writhing. I turned and fled, the laughter echoing behind me, mocking my fear. The hallway stretched again, warping in a way that made my stomach churn. I dashed back toward the doorway I had come through, but it was gone, replaced by a wall of pulsating darkness. My breath quickened, panic clawing at my throat. The whispers filled the air, drowning out my thoughts. You can't escape. You belong to us now. In a final desperate attempt, I turned and charged toward the nearest window, slamming my palms against the glass. The reflections warped, revealing the outside world, a chaotic swirl of colors and shapes, like a painting gone awry. The normalcy I craved felt just out of reach. As I pushed harder, the glass splintered, shards flying everywhere. I felt a rush of hope. If I could break through, I could escape. I could. Suddenly, something icy gripped my ankle, yanking me back. I fell to the floor, my heart racing as I looked up to see shadows closing in, their forms twisting and writhing, seeking to claim me. Help! I screamed, desperation flooding my voice. The shadows loomed closer, their whispers echoing in my mind, urging me to surrender. Just when I thought all hope was lost, a flash of light illuminated the room. I blinked, disoriented, and saw a figure standing in the doorway, tall, dark, and undeniably powerful. The light radiated from them, pushing the shadows back, forcing them to retreat. Run, the figure commanded, their voice a deep echo that resonated within me. Without hesitation, I scrambled to my feet and darted past the figure, the light creating a safe path through the encroaching darkness. I could hear the whispers fading, the shadows retreating, but I didn't stop to look back. I had to escape. As I burst through another door, I found myself in a long, narrow hallway, the light guiding me forward. But ahead, I could see something looming, an archway filled with swirling mist, beckoning me to cross. It felt like a threshold between worlds, a chance to reclaim my reality. But was it truly a way out, or another trap waiting to ensnare me? With a glance over my shoulder, I saw the figure standing guard against the shadows, their presence a comforting reminder of hope. I took a deep breath, knowing I had to take the leap, to embrace whatever lay beyond. I stepped through the archway, the mist enveloping me. As I crossed the threshold, I felt a surge of energy, and everything went dark. I awoke in darkness, the air around me thick and suffocating. My head throbbed, and it took a moment for me to remember where I was, or rather, where I had been. The swirling mist, the figure of light, the shadows, it all felt distant now, like a fading nightmare. But as I stood and glanced around, reality settled in with a crushing weight. I wasn't free. Taking a deep breath, I reached out and touched the surface. It was cold, unnervingly so, and as my fingers brushed against it, the room around me began to warp. The walls shifted, the air thickened, and suddenly, I was no longer in the tunnel. I stood in a field, bathed in sunlight. The sky was a brilliant blue, and the air smelled of fresh grass and flowers. I blinked, disoriented. Was I free? Had I escaped the nightmare? But then, I heard it, the familiar whisper, faint yet unmistakable. You're home now. I turned slowly, dread filling my veins, and saw it. The house. My childhood home, standing tall and pristine, exactly as I remembered it. The windows glinted in the sunlight, the front door slightly ajar. It beckoned to me. I backed away, my heart pounding. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But as I stepped away, the ground beneath me began to shift, the earth pulling me back toward the house. No matter how hard I fought, the pull was stronger, and the house loomed closer, its shadow falling over me. And then I understood. I had never truly left. The house, the shadows, the passage, it was all part of the same thing, a never-ending loop. A prison of my own making. The whispers returned, louder this time, their voices blending into a single, chilling word, stay. I fell to my knees, the weight of it all crashing down on me. There was no escape. There never had been. And as the door to the house creaked open, I knew I was home. Bloody moon. Have you ever felt a chill run down your spine, not from the cold, but from the inexplicable feeling that something, or someone, was watching you? It was a late autumn evening when I first noticed the signs. The air was thick with the scent of damp leaves, and the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving a deep indigo sky splattered with the first stars of the night. The kind of night that lured you outside for a fleeting moment, only to pull you back inside as the darkness wrapped around you like a suffocating blanket. I had just moved into the old Victorian house on the edge of town, a place whispered about in local lore. People claimed it was haunted, that the previous owners had left in a hurry, abandoning their belongings, including an unsettling collection of dolls that lined the attic shelves. I brushed off the tales, thinking them merely a product of small-town superstition. But deep down, something tugged at my curiosity. It was the night of the blood moon, a rare phenomenon that bathed the world in a crimson glow. As I made my way to the kitchen, a sense of unease settled in my gut, as if the very walls were closing in around me. The shadows danced ominously in the flickering light of the candle I had lit, casting distorted shapes that seemed to mock my trepidation. As I reached for a glass, a sudden chill swept through the room, causing me to shiver. I paused, glancing at the window where the moonlight streamed through, illuminating the dusty floor. That's when I saw it, a figure just beyond the glass, momentarily silhouetted against the crimson backdrop. My heart raced as I moved closer, peering out into the darkness. Nothing. Just the rustling of leaves and the distant call of a night owl. I shook off the fear as mere trickery of the light, but the sensation lingered. That night, sleep eluded me. I tossed and turned in bed, the shadows in my room morphing into grotesque forms that whispered secrets I couldn't quite grasp. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. The next day, I decided to explore the house further, hoping to dispel the growing dread. The attic beckoned, filled with remnants of lives once lived. As I climbed the creaky stairs, I felt the air grow heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The attic door creaked open, revealing a treasure trove of forgotten memories, old trunks, dusty books, and yes, the dolls, each one staring back at me with vacant eyes. In the far corner, something caught my attention, a mirror, tarnished with age but still reflecting a distorted image of the room. As I approached, I felt a pull, an urge to look deeper. I reached out, running my fingers along the surface, and a cold shiver ran through me. That's when I heard it, a soft, whispering voice emanating from the mirror, a barely discernible sound that sent a jolt of terror through me. "Help us," it said, the words slithering into my mind like a serpent. I stumbled back, heart pounding, the world around me tilting. Was it a trick of the wind, or had I truly heard something? I couldn't be sure. Panic set in, and I hurried down the stairs, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the attic. Outside, the sun hung low, casting long shadows that danced across the yard. I forced myself to breathe, shaking off the remnants of fear. Perhaps I needed to get out, to clear my mind. As I walked into town, I tried to push away the image of the mirror and the whispers that echoed in my mind. Little did I know, the blood moon was only beginning to unveil its true nature. The shadows were not just figments of my imagination, they were the beginning of something far darker. As night fell once more, I found myself drawn back to the house, an invisible thread pulling me toward the attic. The whispers had intensified, now a cacophony of voices swirling in my head, beckoning me to return. I hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, my hand hovering over the doorknob. What awaited me above? The answer lay hidden in the darkness, waiting for the blood moon to fully rise, and I was about to uncover what had been locked away for far too long. With each creak of the floorboards beneath my feet, I felt as if I were crossing an invisible threshold into a realm where reality blurred with nightmares. The attic door swung open, and the stale, musty air rushed to greet me, wrapping around me like a shroud. The mirror stood there, a dark portal framed in tarnished gold, reflecting not just the room, but something else, something I could almost sense lurking just out of sight. I took a deep breath and approached, each step echoing in the stillness. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a storm. "Help us! Let us out!" The urgency in their voices sent prickles up my spine. Was I really going mad, or was there something more sinister at play? The moment I stood before the mirror, the air shifted, and the whispers crystallized into distinct words. "You can free us. You can bring us back." My heart raced as I leaned closer, staring into the reflective surface. My own face stared back, but there was a flicker, a shadow passing just behind me, a fleeting glimpse of something ancient and malevolent. I felt a pull, as if the mirror was beckoning me, inviting me to step through the veil separating our worlds. The logic in my mind fought against the overwhelming urge to reach out, to touch the cold glass, but something deep within urged me to listen. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the whispers, but they seeped into my consciousness, drowning out my thoughts. Suddenly, a loud crash jolted me back to reality. I spun around to find one of the dolls had toppled from the shelf, its porcelain face grinning at me with an unsettling malice. A rush of adrenaline propelled me to grab the doll and hurl it back across the attic. It landed with a thud, and for a moment, silence enveloped me. Then, the whispering returned, louder than ever. "You must listen. The portal opens only once, with the blood moon. We need you." I staggered back, my mind racing. What were they asking of me? And who were these voices? With a surge of determination, I turned back to the mirror. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The glass rippled, and for a brief moment, I saw images, flashes of anguished faces, twisted figures writhing in torment, and the unmistakable glint of fear in their eyes. "Help us escape," they cried, their voices merging into a symphony of despair. "Free us from this prison." A wave of nausea washed over me. I stumbled back, almost losing my footing as I wrestled with my instincts. Should I help them? Or was this a trap, a manipulation designed to draw me into their world? I was about to turn away when the mirror shimmered once more, this time revealing a small wooden box beside it, one I hadn't noticed before. Curiosity outweighed my fear, and I approached the box cautiously. Its surface was carved with intricate symbols that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. I hesitated before lifting the lid, revealing a collection of trinkets, old keys, shards of glass, and a small vial filled with a dark liquid. The moment I touched the vial, a jolt of energy shot through me. The whispers crescendoed into a chaotic scream, overwhelming me with sensations I couldn't process. Images flashed through my mind, scenes of the house in its former glory, a family living here long ago, and their abrupt, tragic end. The whispers faded into a chilling realization. The blood moon was not just a phenomenon, it was a catalyst for something much darker. I clutched the vial, heart racing as the enormity of what I had stumbled upon crashed over me. The house was not just haunted, it was a prison, a place where the boundaries of life and death blurred, where spirits lingered, trapped by some unspeakable force. And now, as the blood moon reached its zenith, I had unwittingly become a part of their story. With trembling hands, I closed the box and stepped back from the mirror, unsure of what to do next. The air grew colder, the shadows deepening as if sensing my hesitation. I needed to make a choice, help them, or turn away and seal the portal forever. The decision weighed heavily on me as I looked out the attic window. The blood moon loomed large in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape, a silent witness to the turmoil brewing within me. I could feel the weight of the spirit's hopes and fears resting on my shoulders, an unbreakable bond forged by desperation. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. If I was going to make a choice, I needed to understand what I was dealing with. The whispers continued, persistent and demanding, but the gravity of the moment pulled me deeper into contemplation. What lay ahead was unknown, but one thing was clear: the blood moon had awakened something that could not be easily put to rest. The night deepened, and the shadows in the attic felt alive, swirling around me as I wrestled with my choice. My heart raced, pounding in my ears like a war drum, urging me to act. The whispers morphed into a chant, a rhythmic pleading that drew me closer to the mirror. You must open the portal. You are the key. I gripped the wooden box tightly, the vial inside a weighty promise. What would happen if I opened the portal? Would I unleash the spirits trapped within, or would I invite something far more sinister into my world? I had read tales of spirits bound to this realm, cursed to linger until their stories were told. But I had never imagined I would be at the center of one. Gazing into the mirror, I was struck by a vision, flickering images of the house as it once was, filled with laughter, life, and then darkness. I saw family, parents, and their children, caught in a moment of panic, their faces twisted in fear as shadows closed in around them. I felt a deep ache in my chest, a tugging at the edges of my memory, as if I were meant to bear witness to their suffering. As the whispers swelled, I felt a surge of empathy. What happened to you? I breathed, the question slipping from my lips like a prayer. The blood moon calls, they responded, the chorus enveloping me. We were betrayed, trapped in this place by a darkness we could not escape. You can free us if you listen. You must make the choice. In that moment, I felt the vial vibrating against my palm, its dark liquid alive with potential. My mind raced with possibilities. Could I truly set them free? And if I did, what price would I pay? As if sensing my resolve, the attic grew colder. A gust of wind whipped through the room, rattling the windows and stirring the dust that had settled for decades. I stumbled back, my heart in my throat, but the pull toward the mirror was undeniable. It felt as though the house itself was urging me forward, urging me to act. With a sudden burst of courage, I set the box on the floor and opened it again. The vial glimmered in the moonlight, a sliver of hope wrapped in uncertainty. I lifted it carefully, its weight grounding me as I stepped closer to the mirror. If I do this, you must promise to show me the truth, I declared, my voice steadying despite the fear curling in my stomach. We will show you everything, they promised, their voices resonating with a chilling harmony. The portal will open. We will guide you. I hesitated for a heartbeat, then uncorked the vial. The moment the stopper came free, a rush of cold air surged from the glass, enveloping me in a frigid embrace. I felt the whispers coalesce into something more tangible, an energy pulsating through the room, begging for release. With trembling hands, I tipped the vial toward the mirror. The dark liquid poured forth, shimmering as it cascaded against the glass surface. A blinding light erupted, momentarily blinding me. I stumbled back, shielding my eyes, but when I dared to look again, the mirror had transformed. What had been a simple reflection now revealed a swirling abyss, a chasm filled with spectral lights and shadowy figures. The room around me fell silent, and all that remained was the intoxicating pull of the portal. "Step through," they urged, their voices now a steady hum. "Find the truth." I took a deep breath, fear clashing with an overwhelming curiosity. What awaited me on the other side? Was this truly a rescue, or was I walking into a trap set by malevolent forces? But there was no turning back. I was inextricably drawn to the portal. Gathering my courage, I took a step forward, feeling the energy envelop me like a warm embrace. The moment I crossed the threshold, the world around me dissolved, and I was pulled into a swirling maelstrom of light and darkness. Time lost meaning as I was swept away, the sounds of the attic fading into a distant echo. I was no longer in my house, but in a realm where shadows reigned, and the air was thick with despair. I found myself standing in a fog-laden landscape, surrounded by the silhouettes of the spirits I had glimpsed through the mirror. The figures coalesced into distinct shapes, their faces twisted with agony and longing. "You've come," one whispered, a woman with hollow eyes that seemed to reach into my very soul. "You are our last hope. What do you want from me?" I stammered, the fear creeping back as I realized the enormity of my choice. "We need you to bear witness," she said, stepping closer. "We were wronged, and our story must be told. Only then can we find peace." I looked around at the gathering storm of spirits, each one carrying a burden of sorrow that mirrored my own fears. In that moment, I understood this wasn't just about freeing them, it was about confronting the darkness that had consumed them, and perhaps something within myself. Gazing into the mirror, I was struck by a vision, flickering images of the house as it once was, filled with laughter, life, and then darkness. I saw family, parents, and their children, caught in a moment of panic, their faces twisted in fear as shadows closed in around them. I felt a deep ache in my chest, a tugging at the edges of my memory, as if I were meant to bear witness to their suffering. As the whispers swelled, I felt a surge of empathy. "What happened to you?" I breathed, the question slipping from my lips like a prayer. "The blood moon calls," they responded, the chorus enveloping me. "We were betrayed, trapped in this place by a darkness we could not escape. You can free us if you listen. You must make the choice." In that moment, I felt the vial vibrating against my palm, its dark liquid alive with potential. My mind raced with possibilities. Could I truly set them free? And if I did, what price would I pay? As if sensing my resolve, the attic grew colder. A gust of wind whipped through the room, rattling the windows and stirring the dust that had settled for decades. I stumbled back, my heart in my throat, but the pull toward the mirror was undeniable. It felt as though the house itself was urging me forward, urging me to act. With a sudden burst of courage, I set the box on the floor and opened it again. The vial glimmered in the moonlight, a sliver of hope wrapped in uncertainty. I lifted it carefully, its weight grounding me as I stepped closer to the mirror. "If I do this, you must promise to show me the truth," I declared, my voice steadying despite the fear curling in my stomach. "We will show you everything," they promised, their voices resonating with a chilling harmony. "The portal will open. We will guide you." I hesitated for a heartbeat, then uncorked the vial. The moment the stopper came free, a rush of cold air surged from the glass, enveloping me in a frigid embrace. I felt the whispers coalesce into something more tangible, an energy pulsating through the room, begging for release. With trembling hands, I tipped the vial toward the mirror. The dark liquid poured forth, shimmering as it cascaded against the glass surface. A blinding light erupted, momentarily blinding me. I stumbled back, shielding my eyes, but when I dared to look again, the mirror had transformed. What had been a simple reflection now revealed a swirling abyss, a chasm filled with spectral lights and shadowy figures. The room around me fell silent, and all that remained was the intoxicating pull of the portal. "Step through," they urged, their voices now a steady hum. "Find the truth." I took a deep breath, fear clashing with an overwhelming curiosity. What awaited me on the other side? Was this truly a rescue, or was I walking into a trap set by malevolent forces? But there was no turning back. I was inextricably drawn to the portal. Gathering my courage, I took a step forward, feeling the energy envelop me like a warm embrace. The moment I crossed the threshold, the world around me dissolved, and I was pulled into a swirling maelstrom of light and darkness. Time lost meaning as I was swept away, the sounds of the attic fading into a distant echo. I was no longer in my house, but in a realm where shadows reigned, and the air was thick with despair. I found myself standing in a fog-laden landscape, surrounded by the silhouettes of the spirits I had glimpsed through the mirror. The figures coalesced into distinct shapes, their faces twisted with agony and longing. "You've come," one whispered, a woman with hollow eyes that seemed to reach into my very soul. "You are our last hope. What do you want from me?" I stammered, the fear creeping back as I realized the enormity of my choice. "We need you to bear witness," she said, stepping closer. "We were wronged, and our story must be told. Only then can we find peace." I looked around at the gathering storm of spirits, each one carrying a burden of sorrow that mirrored my own fears. In that moment, I understood this wasn't just about freeing them, it was about confronting the darkness that had consumed them, and perhaps something within myself. As they began to dissolve into the light, I felt a pang of loss, but also an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. I had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. Their stories would live on, etched into the very fabric of the house, and in my heart, I carried the weight of their memories. The landscape around me began to fade, the fog lifting to reveal the attic once more, illuminated by the soft glow of the blood moon. I was back in my house, the air still and heavy, but the oppressive shadows had vanished. The mirror stood silent, its surface calm, as if it had never held the weight of sorrow. I took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the moonlight wash over me. The whispers were gone, replaced by a profound silence, a silence that felt like freedom. As I made my way down the stairs, I understood the truth. I had not just saved the spirits, but had also confronted my own fears. The blood moon had shown me the power of stories, the strength in facing darkness, and the resilience of hope. And as I stepped into the night, I knew that the tale of the house would be told, a legacy woven into the very bones of its structure, a reminder that even in the depths of despair, light can always prevail. The ghost of the old theater. Have you ever felt that someone was watching you, even in the most familiar places? I remember the first time I stepped onto the stage of the old theater. The wood creaked beneath my feet, and a thick layer of dust hung in the air, illuminated by the dim light of the overhead bulbs. There was something magnetic about it, as if the very essence of the place called out to me. The theater had stood for nearly a century, hosting countless performances and housing stories that echoed through its walls. But there was a darker side, one that only revealed itself to those willing to listen. I had just landed a lead role in the upcoming production, and the excitement buzzed through me like electricity. The cast was a mix of seasoned actors and fresh faces, and we often gathered in the cramped green room to share laughter and nerves. But as the rehearsals progressed, a subtle shift began to creep into our performances. The first hint came during a particularly quiet scene where my character was meant to confront her fears alone on stage. I remember the audience's silence, how it wrapped around me like a shroud. That's when I felt it, an icy breath on the back of my neck, a presence lurking just beyond the stage lights. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see one of my castmates joking around, but the stage was empty. A chill ran down my spine. Did anyone else feel that? I asked, brushing it off with a nervous laugh. A few cast members exchanged uneasy glances, but most shrugged it off, attributing it to the theater's age and our overactive imaginations. As rehearsals continued, strange occurrences multiplied. Props would go missing only to reappear in odd places. The sound of footsteps echoed through the empty halls, and the air grew thick with an unsettling energy. Each time the lights flickered, I felt a pang of anxiety, as if something was watching, waiting for its moment. One evening, after a particularly grueling rehearsal, I found myself lingering backstage. The other actors had left, but I felt an odd compulsion to stay. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional creak of the old building settling. As I paced, the air grew colder, and I could swear I heard a whisper, a name, or perhaps a warning. I turned abruptly, half expecting to see someone, but the stage remained empty, and the whisper faded into nothing. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself. I was being ridiculous. But as I stepped toward the exit, a fleeting shadow caught my eye on the stage. My heart raced as I squinted into the dim light. There, just beyond the reach of the spotlight, stood a figure, a translucent silhouette, almost human in shape, yet distinctly not alive. Frozen in place, I couldn't tear my gaze away. It was as if the spirit was urging me to remember something long forgotten, something buried deep within the theater's history. A surge of fear clawed at my insides, but an equally compelling curiosity pulled me closer. What was this ghost? A former actor? A victim of the theater's tragedies? The question swirled in my mind, filling me with a mix of dread and fascination. I had to know more. And so began my journey into the past of the old theater, a quest that would lead me down dark paths, revealing secrets that were meant to stay buried. Little did I know, the more I uncovered, the more entwined I would become with the very spirit that haunted the stage. The moment I stepped back into the theater, a wave of trepidation washed over me. I had decided to investigate, driven by a mixture of fear and fascination. Each creak of the floorboards underfoot seemed to echo the whispers of the past, and the faint scent of dust and age hung heavily in the air. I could almost feel the history pulsating around me, begging to be uncovered. I began my research the next day, poring over old newspaper clippings and archives at the local library. The theater had a storied past, with its grand opening celebrated by the elite of the town. Yet, alongside the accolades were tales of misfortune, accidents, sudden deaths, and strange disappearances. I discovered that several actors had met tragic ends, their lives cut short under mysterious circumstances. Each story was like a thread in a tapestry of grief, leading me deeper into the theater's haunted legacy. One name kept reappearing, Eleanor Gray. A leading lady in the theater's early days, she had vanished one fateful night during a performance, leaving behind nothing but whispers and unanswered questions. The authorities had searched for her, but she seemed to have slipped through the cracks of time, leaving only her ghost behind. The more I read about her, the more I felt a connection, an inexplicable pull toward her tragic story. That night, as I rehearsed my lines in front of the mirror in the green room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. The lights flickered again, casting long shadows across the walls. I felt a chill run down my spine, and the whisper from before returned, clearer this time, "Eleanor." I glanced around, my heart pounding in my chest. It was just me and the reflection staring back at me, but there was something else, something lurking just beyond my sight. I took a deep breath, steeling my resolve. I needed to confront whatever was haunting me. As rehearsals progressed, the presence became more palpable. I could sense Eleanor's spirit more distinctly during our evening performances. It was as if she was drawn to me, urging me to dig deeper into her story. My fellow actors began to notice my growing obsession, and while some were supportive, others were dismissive, brushing it off as mere theatrics. "Daisy, you're getting too into this role," my friend Tom joked one evening, nudging me playfully. "Next, you'll be saying the theater is haunted." But the air around me felt charged, almost electric. I had started to experience vivid dreams where I found myself standing on stage, bathed in moonlight. Eleanor's silhouette would appear, her face a haunting blend of beauty and sorrow. I could see her lips moving, but no sound escaped. Each time I awoke, I felt drained, as if the weight of her despair clung to me. One night, during a late rehearsal, the director decided we would run the final scene, a climactic confrontation where my character finally faces her fears. As the lights dimmed and the atmosphere thickened with tension, I felt an overwhelming urge to channel Eleanor's spirit. It was as if I was no longer just acting but becoming her, feeling her anguish wash over me. As I reached the climax of the scene, the lights flickered violently. A sudden chill swept through the theater, and for a moment, I thought I saw Eleanor standing behind me, her expression a mixture of desperation and longing. The moment sent a shiver down my spine, and I faltered, nearly breaking character. But then something unexpected happened. The lights stabilized, and the audience erupted in applause, unaware of the tension that had just unfolded behind the scenes. My fellow actors beamed at me, but I felt uneasy, as if something dark had brushed against my soul. In the following days, I began to notice peculiar happenings around the theater. Props would inexplicably shift positions, and whispers echoed through the empty corridors, always beckoning me toward the old dressing rooms. The more I resisted, the stronger the pull became, igniting a sense of fear I couldn't shake. I decided I had to confront this spirit head-on. There had to be a reason Eleanor was reaching out to me, and I was determined to discover it. One evening, I returned to the theater alone, armed with only a flashlight and my resolve. The air was thick with anticipation as I made my way backstage, the shadows stretching ominously around me. "Eleanor," I called softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want from me?" For a heartbeat, silence reigned, and then the temperature dropped suddenly. The air crackled with energy, and I felt an icy breath brush against my neck. A soft whisper curled around my ears, chilling me to the bone, "Help me." I swallowed hard, the weight of her plea settling heavily in my chest. I had no idea what I was getting into, but I knew I was inextricably linked to this ghostly presence. Little did I realize, my journey was just beginning. "Help me." The words hung in the air, heavy with urgency. I stood frozen, my heart racing as I felt Eleanor's presence intensify. I had come to the theater seeking answers, yet now I was consumed by fear. What kind of help did she need? And what did it mean for me? With a mix of dread and determination, I took a step forward. The darkness around me felt alive, and the flickering flashlight cast unsettling shadows on the walls. "How can I help you?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Suddenly, the room was filled with a soft glow, as if the very air had illuminated with Eleanor's essence. I gasped, my breath hitching as I caught a glimpse of her figure, ethereal, with long hair cascading like a veil. Her eyes were filled with a sorrow that pierced my heart, and for a moment I felt an overwhelming connection. In that instant, memories flooded my mind, images of a grand theater, the vibrant audience, and then chaos. I saw her, dressed in elegant attire, a smile gracing her lips as she took her bow. But the scene shifted rapidly. I witnessed a frantic backstage, whispers of a fight, the flicker of lights, and then darkness. I staggered back, overwhelmed. "Eleanor, what happened to you?" Her figure wavered, and in that fleeting moment, I understood she had been wronged. The ghost of the old theater was not merely a lost spirit, she was a victim of betrayal, her life stolen away amidst jealousy and greed. "Find the truth," she whispered, her voice echoing in my mind. "Break the silence." As quickly as she had appeared, Eleanor vanished, leaving me alone in the oppressive darkness. My thoughts raced, piecing together the fragments of her story. I had to dig deeper into the theater's history, uncovering not just her fate, but also the threads that wove together the lives of those who had tread the boards before me. Over the next few days, I spent every waking hour searching through old records, piecing together accounts of the night she vanished. The deeper I delved, the more unsettling the revelations became. There were whispers of rivalries among the cast, a love triangle that spiraled into chaos, and a tragic accident that the theater management had tried to bury. I discovered that Eleanor had been in love with a fellow actor, someone who had been involved with another leading lady. The night she disappeared was marked by a heated confrontation. Eyewitnesses had reported shouting, followed by the sound of something heavy crashing backstage. But after the dust settled, Eleanor was nowhere to be found. The investigation had been brief, and the case closed quickly, leaving the theater to carry on as if nothing had happened. Each revelation deepened my resolve to uncover the truth. I returned to the theater that night, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. I knew I had to confront the spirit of Eleanor once more, to offer her the justice she deserved. The theater was dark and still, every shadow feeling like a watchful eye. I made my way to the stage, where I had last felt her presence. As I stood there, I felt the familiar chill wash over me, and I called out again, "Eleanor, I'm here. I want to help you." I know what happened. The lights flickered, and for a moment, I feared I had imagined everything. But then, the air shifted, and I felt her presence again, stronger this time. She appeared before me, more vivid, her sorrowful eyes locked onto mine. "You've come back," she whispered, a hint of hope in her voice. "You must reveal the truth." "What do I need to do?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Follow the echoes," she replied, her form shimmering like mist. "They will lead you to the answers you seek." The atmosphere grew tense, and I felt an overwhelming urge to follow her guidance. I closed my eyes, listening intently. I could hear faint whispers, like echoes of the past, familiar voices, fragments of conversations long gone. I opened my eyes, instinctively drawn toward the old dressing room, a place I had avoided until now. As I approached, the door creaked open, as if inviting me inside. The room was dimly lit, filled with relics of the theater's former glory. Old costumes hung like specters, and the mirrors reflected not just my image, but something deeper, memories trapped in time. I stepped further in, heart racing, until I noticed an ornate box tucked away in the corner. I felt a compulsion to open it, as if it held the key to Eleanor's truth. With shaking hands, I lifted the lid. Inside lay a collection of letters, faded and yellowed with age. As I read the first few lines, my breath caught in my throat. They were love letters, passionate declarations between Eleanor and her secret lover, revealing a relationship fraught with tension and jealousy. But among the letters, one stood out, its handwriting shaky and frantic. It spoke of betrayal and fear, warning Eleanor to stay away from the theater on a certain night. My heart raced as I pieced it together. This was the night she vanished. The implications hit me like a wave. Someone had known what was going to happen, and yet she had been drawn into the darkness. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from behind me, jolting me out of my thoughts. The mirrors shattered, the glass raining down like confetti, and I felt a rush of cold air. Eleanor's figure materialized before me, her expression one of anguish. "Run!" she screamed, and the force of her presence pushed me back toward the exit. Panic surged within me, but I couldn't leave her behind. "Eleanor, I can help you." "Find the truth," she echoed, her voice fading as the room darkened around me. The chaos swirled, pulling me away until I stumbled back into the hall, breathless and shaken. I had uncovered the first piece of the puzzle, but I realized I was running out of time. If I was to help Eleanor find peace, I needed to confront the very source of her pain, the jealous rival who had cast the shadows over her life. With my heart pounding in my chest, I knew that confronting Eleanor's rival was my only path forward. The more I learned, the clearer it became. To truly help Eleanor, I needed to unveil the truth that had been buried alongside her. I was running out of time. The presence in the theater was growing stronger, more aggressive. I spent the next day searching for clues about Eleanor's rival, the woman who had inadvertently played a role in her tragic end. Her name was Marissa Hale, another talented actress who had once been a rising star in the theater. However, after Eleanor's disappearance, Marissa's career had faltered. I learned that she had left town shortly afterward, her whereabouts unknown. Determined to find her, I reached out to old contacts in the theater community, following a trail that led me to a small town a few hours away. When I arrived, I felt a heavy sense of foreboding, as if the very air vibrated with unspoken tension. I found Marissa living in a modest cottage, the windows drawn tight, a shadow of the vibrant woman she once had been. As I approached the door, my heart raced. This was it, the moment I had been preparing for. I knocked, the sound echoing in the quiet afternoon. After a long pause, the door creaked open, revealing a woman with sunken eyes and a haunted expression. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Marissa Hale?" I replied, trying to keep my tone steady. "I'm here about Eleanor Gray." At the mention of Eleanor's name, her face paled, and I saw a flicker of fear cross her features. "You shouldn't be here," she murmured, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Please, I need to know what happened that night." "Eleanor deserves the truth," I pleaded, stepping closer. Marissa hesitated, the weight of her silence palpable. Finally, she sighed and stepped aside, allowing me to enter. The room was dimly lit, filled with mementos of a life once lived in the spotlight. A framed photo of Eleanor hung on the wall, and I felt the chill in the air deepen. "I didn't want it to end like this," Marissa began, her voice trembling. "We were both in love with the same man, Richard. He led us both to believe we were special to him." "Richard?" I echoed, the name familiar from my research. "He was a part of the theater, right?" "Yes," she nodded, her eyes clouding with memories. "That night, there was a fight. Eleanor confronted me, desperate and hurt. I wanted to tell her the truth, but it was too late. He had already twisted our feelings, setting us against each other." I listened intently, piecing together the fragments. "What happened next? Did you see her after the argument?" Marissa's gaze dropped to the floor, shame washing over her. No. I went to my dressing room, but I heard the commotion. The lights flickered, and then silence. When I came out, she was gone. What did Richard do? I pressed, sensing the fear in her voice. He was frantic, claiming she'd run away. But I always wondered. She hesitated, as if grappling with the weight of her own words. I think he might have known more than he let on. The realization struck me like a lightning bolt. Richard had played both women, weaving a web of jealousy and betrayal that had ensnared them both. But why had he escaped the scrutiny? The pieces were finally falling into place. I need to find Richard, I declared, determination surging within me. If he knows what happened to Eleanor, I have to confront him. Be careful, Marissa warned, her voice a mix of concern and fear. He has a way of charming people, hiding his true self behind a mask. As I left Marissa's cottage, I felt the weight of her revelations pressing down on me. I had to unravel the threads that tied Richard to Eleanor's fate. The theater had been a stage for their lives, but it was also a stage for their deception. That evening, I returned to the theater one last time, steeling myself for the confrontation ahead. The air was thick with tension as I stepped onto the stage, the shadows looming like specters around me. I needed answers, and I hoped the spirit of Eleanor would guide me. Eleanor, I called out, my voice resonating in the empty space. I'm here to find the truth. Help me. For a moment, silence enveloped me. Then, the temperature dropped, and I felt her presence again, wrapping around me like a comforting cloak. Find him, she urged softly, the echo of her voice stirring the air. With renewed resolve, I gathered my courage and made my way to Richard's last known address. When I arrived, a small, unassuming house greeted me. The door was ajar, and I could hear muffled voices inside. I hesitated, my heart racing, then pushed the door open. Inside, Richard sat in a dimly lit living room, laughing with a friend, a drink in his hand. The sight of him ignited a mixture of anger and fear within me. How could he sit there, so carefree, knowing what had happened? Richard! I shouted, startling him. He turned, his expression shifting from surprise to a charming smile, as if he were the hero of a play rather than a man who had caused untold pain. Daisy, isn't it? He replied, feigning innocence. What brings you here? Stop pretending. I spat, my voice rising. You know what happened to Eleanor. You were there. His demeanor changed instantly, the charm slipping away. I have no idea what you're talking about, he said coldly, the facade crumbling. Liar. I pressed, my voice trembling with emotion. You manipulated her and Marissa. You left a path of destruction, and now you're hiding behind lies. The tension in the room thickened as Richard's expression darkened. You shouldn't meddle in things you don't understand, he warned, his voice low and dangerous. Eleanor was a fool. She thought she could have it all. In that moment, I felt Eleanor's presence strengthen beside me, her sorrow transforming into anger. You can't hide forever, Richard, I declared, emboldened by her spirit. You're going to answer for what you did. Suddenly, the lights began to flicker violently, the air crackling with energy. I could see Eleanor's shadow forming behind me, a spectral force demanding justice. Richard's bravado faltered, and he took a step back, uncertainty flashing across his face. No, he shouted, glancing around in panic. This isn't happening. But it was too late. The theater had claimed him, the very stage that had witnessed his betrayals now rising against him. Shadows twisted and churned, wrapping around him like tendrils of darkness. I stood my ground, feeling Eleanor's strength surge through me. "Face the truth," I shouted, the words ringing in the air. "You can't run from your past." Richard's pleas turned into screams as the shadows enveloped him, dragging him into the darkness. The room trembled, and for a moment, I feared for my own safety. But then, in an instant, everything fell silent. The light steadied, and Richard was gone, leaving only an oppressive stillness in his wake. Eleanor's spirit appeared before me, her expression one of gratitude and release. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice warm and filled with relief. "You set me free." Tears filled my eyes as I realized what I had done. I had helped her find peace, confronting the darkness that had haunted her for so long. "I couldn't have done it without you," I said, feeling a profound sense of connection. As her spirit began to fade, I felt a warmth envelop me, a comforting presence reassuring me that she was finally free. "Remember me," she said softly, her figure dissolving into the air. The theater felt different now, lighter somehow, as if the burdens of the past had been lifted. I stepped off the stage, the echoes of Eleanor's laughter mingling with the soft whispers of the theater, a melody of memories long silenced. In that moment, I knew I would carry her story forward, ensuring that her truth would never be forgotten. The old theater, once a place of darkness, had transformed into a sanctuary of light, a testament to resilience and the enduring power of truth. Demonic artifact. Have you ever stumbled upon something that changed your life forever? Something that whispered secrets from the past, coaxing you into a realm of the unknown? That was my fate one fateful summer afternoon when a simple trip to the local antique shop turned into a descent into horror. The shop, nestled between a faded cafe and a forgotten bookstore, looked unassuming from the outside, its windows cluttered with dusty trinkets and aging furniture. I had been searching for a unique piece to decorate my new apartment, something with character, and I certainly didn't expect to find anything extraordinary. But curiosity always gets the better of me, and as I pushed through the creaky door, a small bell tinkled above me, announcing my arrival. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and dust. Shelves sagged under the weight of time-worn books, tarnished silverware, and the kind of oddities that seemed to gather stories like cobwebs. An elderly woman sat behind the counter, her glasses perched on the tip of her nose as she peered at me over a mound of paperwork. "Welcome, dear. Looking for anything in particular?" Her voice was gentle, tinged with a warmth that belied the shadows of the shop. "Just browsing, thanks," I replied, already drifting toward a back corner where the light was dimmer and the items appeared more eclectic. As I perused an assortment of vintage clocks and faded photographs, something caught my eye, a small, intricately carved box. It was tucked away on a lower shelf, nearly hidden behind a stack of dusty novels. The box was made of dark wood, with strange symbols etched into its surface. It was both beautiful and unsettling, like a relic from a forgotten civilization. I knelt down to examine it more closely, the cool wood against my fingertips sending a shiver up my spine. "What's this?" I murmured, glancing over my shoulder to ensure the shopkeeper wasn't watching. There was something about the box that felt wrong. It called to me, pulling me like a moth to a flame. "Ah, that one," the woman said, now at my side, her voice laced with a hint of apprehension. "It's an artifact from the old world. Not much is known about it, but they say it can awaken what's been long asleep." "Awaken what?" I asked, raising an eyebrow, half amused and half curious. The ancients believed it could contact spirits, entities that dwell beyond our realm. They used it in rituals, trying to commune with forces they didn't fully understand. Her eyes darkened. Many who've owned it have never been the same. A chill ran through me. I should have walked away right then, but the box's allure was undeniable. "How much?" I asked, half expecting her to laugh and tell me it wasn't for sale. $40, she replied, her gaze steady and knowing. I hesitated, then nodded. In the back of my mind, a warning flickered, but I brushed it aside, dismissing it as mere superstition. I handed over the cash, and she placed the box in my hands, her fingers lingering a moment too long, as if reluctant to part with it. "Be careful, dear. Not everything should be disturbed." I laughed off her warning as I stepped back into the sunlight, the box cradled in my arms. It felt heavy, like a secret waiting to be unearthed. That evening, as I set it on my coffee table, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had brought something sinister into my home. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across my living room. I studied the box, tracing the symbols with my fingertip. The deeper I looked, the more the symbols seemed to shift, almost alive, pulsing with a dark energy that sent a thrill down my spine. As night fell, I found myself unable to tear my eyes away from it. Was it just my imagination, or did the air around the box grow colder? I shook my head, trying to dispel the creeping dread. I was being ridiculous. But as I settled onto the couch, the box sat there, a silent sentinel, beckoning me to uncover its secrets. What happened next would forever alter the course of my life. As I lay on the couch, the weight of the box felt like a tether to the unknown. I struggled to focus on the television, my thoughts swirling around the warnings of the shopkeeper. What if she was right? I shook my head, trying to laugh it off. It was just an antique. But as the night deepened, so did my unease. Demonic artifact. Have you ever stumbled upon something that changed your life forever? Something that whispered secrets from the past, coaxing you into a realm of the unknown? That was my fate one fateful summer afternoon, when a simple trip to the local antique shop turned into a descent into horror. The shop, nestled between a faded cafe and a forgotten bookstore, looked unassuming from the outside, its windows cluttered with dusty trinkets and aging furniture. I had been searching for a unique piece to decorate my new apartment, something with character, and I certainly didn't expect to find anything extraordinary. But curiosity always gets the better of me, and as I pushed through the creaky door, a small bell tinkled above me, announcing my arrival. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and dust. Shelves sagged under the weight of time-worn books, tarnished silverware, and the kind of oddities that seemed to gather stories like cobwebs. An elderly woman sat behind the counter, her glasses perched on the tip of her nose as she peered at me over a mound of paperwork. "Welcome, dear. Looking for anything in particular?" Her voice was gentle, tinged with a warmth that belied the shadows of the shop. "Just browsing, thanks," I replied, already drifting toward a back corner where the light was dimmer and the items appeared more eclectic. As I perused an assortment of vintage clocks and faded photographs, something caught my eye, a small, intricately carved box. It was tucked away on a lower shelf, nearly hidden behind a stack of dusty novels. The box was made of dark wood, with strange symbols etched into its surface. It was both beautiful and unsettling, like a relic from a forgotten civilization. I knelt down to examine it more closely, the cool wood against my fingertips sending a shiver up my spine. "What's this?" I murmured, glancing over my shoulder to ensure the shopkeeper wasn't watching. There was something about the box that felt wrong. It called to me, pulling me like a moth to a flame. "Ah, that one," the woman said, now at my side, her voice laced with a hint of apprehension. "It's an artifact from the old world. Not much is known about it, but they say it can awaken what's been long asleep." "Awaken what?" I asked, raising an eyebrow, half amused and half curious. "The ancients believed it could contact spirits, entities that dwell beyond our realm. They used it in rituals, trying to commune with forces they didn't fully understand." Her eyes darkened. "Many who've owned it have never been the same." A chill ran through me. I should have walked away right then, but the box's allure was undeniable. "How much?" I asked, half expecting her to laugh and tell me it wasn't for sale. $40, she replied, her gaze steady and knowing. I hesitated, then nodded. In the back of my mind, a warning flickered, but I brushed it aside, dismissing it as mere superstition. I handed over the cash, and she placed the box in my hands, her fingers lingering a moment too long, as if reluctant to part with it. "Be careful, dear. Not everything should be disturbed." I laughed off her warning as I stepped back into the sunlight, the box cradled in my arms. It felt heavy, like a secret waiting to be unearthed. That evening, as I set it on my coffee table, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had brought something sinister into my home. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across my living room. I studied the box, tracing the symbols with my fingertip. The deeper I looked, the more the symbols seemed to shift, almost alive, pulsing with a dark energy that sent a thrill down my spine. As night fell, I found myself unable to tear my eyes away from it. Was it just my imagination, or did the air around the box grow colder? I shook my head, trying to dispel the creeping dread. I was being ridiculous. But as I settled onto the couch, the box sat there, a silent sentinel, beckoning me to uncover its secrets. What happened next would forever alter the course of my life. As I lay on the couch, the weight of the box felt like a tether to the unknown. I struggled to focus on the television, my thoughts swirling around the warnings of the shopkeeper. What if she was right? I shook my head, trying to laugh it off. It was just an antique. But as the night deepened, so did my unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the building made my heart race, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder as I moved about. I switched on the television, hoping to drown out the noise in my head, but the words of the shopkeeper echoed in my mind, "Find no one who awakened it." The night wore on, and despite my best efforts to distract myself, I felt a compulsion to open the box once more. What if the voice had been a trick of my imagination? Perhaps there was nothing sinister at all. Just a stupid artifact. As darkness fell, I felt a pull toward the box. My fingers trembled as I reached for it, but would cool against my skin. What would happen if I opened it again? I needed answers, and I felt like a moth drawn to a flame. With a deep breath, I opened the lid, the familiar sound of wood creaking echoing in the silence. The moment the box was ajar, the air shifted, becoming dense and charged. I glanced around nervously, but I was alone. "Let me in," the voice returned, clear this time, filled with an urgency that resonated deep within me. "Why?" I whispered, almost pleading. "What do you want?" "Freedom," it replied, the word vibrating through the air. As I stared into the box, a strange vision flickered in my mind, a dark, endless void, swirling with shadows. I felt a sense of longing mixed with dread, as if something from that darkness craved my attention. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. I am what you have awakened. I am what has been waiting. Panic surged through me. I slammed the lid shut, but it felt like a feeble gesture against the power that pulsed around me. What had I done? I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my coffee table. My heart raced as I fought against the suffocating atmosphere. I needed to get away from the box, to escape whatever I had invited into my life. But the moment I turned to leave, the lights flickered and dimmed, plunging the room into semi-darkness. My pulse quickened as the shadows deepened, and the feeling of being watched intensified. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and desperate. Then came the sound, a low, guttural growl reverberated through the room, emanating from the box. It was a sound I had never heard before, primal and ancient. I pressed my back against the wall, my mind racing. I had to contain this. I had to close the door I had opened. But the box began to shake, a low rumble vibrating through the floor. The shadows coalesced, swirling into a dark mist that seemed to stretch toward me. I gasped, feeling the air grow cold and thick, constricting around my throat. "Let me in," the voice cried, louder now, echoing through the room. "No!" I shouted, trying to ground myself, to remember that this was just a box, just an artifact. But as I looked into the swirling darkness, I saw flashes of grotesque faces, contorted in silent screams, reaching out toward me. My heart pounded as I realized these were the lost souls, trapped and crying for help. I needed to act. I grabbed the box and, with all my strength, hurled it across the room. It smashed against the wall, the lid flying open. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel the darkness swirling around me, desperate to escape. Suddenly, a blinding light erupted from the box, illuminating the room and pushing the shadows back. I shielded my eyes, feeling a surge of heat as the light engulfed me. The voices escalated into a cacophony of rage and despair, resonating in my mind. "Close the door! Close the door!" they cried, and instinctively, I lunged toward the box, grabbing the lid and slamming it shut. Silence fell. I collapsed onto the floor, breathing heavily, heart racing. The air around me was still, but the weight of the darkness lingered, pressing against my chest. I looked at the box, now still and silent. What had just happened? As I gathered my thoughts, I felt a twinge of relief mixed with dread. I had contained it, for now. But the voice still echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder of what lay within. I needed to find out more about the entity I had awakened, and I needed to do it fast. I grabbed my phone and searched online for any mention of the artifact or the symbols etched into its surface. Hours slipped away as I scoured through countless forums and articles, but every lead seemed to vanish into a void of uncertainty. Just as I began to feel hopeless, I stumbled upon a post from an obscure blog about ancient artifacts. It mentioned a group dedicated to studying relics like mine, warning of the dangers associated with them. They called themselves the Keepers of the Forgotten. A shiver ran through me. I had to find them. They might know how to undo the chaos I had unleashed. As I clicked on the contact link, the phone rang, and with every ring, my heart sank deeper into fear. What if it was too late? What if I was already too far gone? The phone rang on, each chime echoing my growing anxiety. What if I couldn't reach the Keepers of the Forgotten in time? The darkness I had felt earlier loomed over me, a specter waiting for its moment to strike. Finally, a voice answered, deep and resonant, tinged with urgency. "Keeper's Lodge. How may we assist you?" "I found an artifact, an ancient box. I think I've awakened something terrible," I stammered, my voice trembling. I poured out my story, my words tumbling over each other, trying to convey the sense of dread that clung to me. Calm down. Stay with me, the voice replied, steadying me. What did you say the symbols looked like? I described them as best as I could, and the voice on the other end fell silent for a moment, as if considering the weight of my discovery. That box is not just an artifact. It's a vessel, a doorway to the other side. You must act quickly. We can help you, but you have to come to us. I'll do anything, I said, desperation fueling my resolve. Where are you located? Head to the old church at the edge of town. Come along. Bring the box. My stomach twisted at the thought of returning to the artifact, but I had no choice. I needed to confront whatever I had awakened. As I made my way to the church, the streets felt alien, shadows stretching and twisting, whispering warnings in hushed tones. Was it too late? Had I already crossed a line from which there was no return? The church loomed ahead, a relic of a bygone era, its Gothic spires piercing the night sky. The doors creaked open as I approached, revealing a dimly lit interior filled with candles flickering in the darkness. In the center stood a circle of figures cloaked in deep blue robes, their faces obscured by hoods. "Welcome, Seeker," one of them said, stepping forward. "You have brought the box?" I nodded, placing it on the altar at the center of the circle. "Please, I need your help." The keepers studied the box, their expressions unreadable. After a moment, the same figure who had spoken raised his hands, beckoning the others to join him. They formed a protective circle around the artifact, chanting in a low, rhythmic tone that resonated through the air. As they chanted, the shadows in the church seemed to dance, swirling toward the box. I felt a pull, an unseen force trying to draw me closer. I stepped back, a cold sweat forming on my brow. The air grew thick, heavy with tension as the voices of the keepers rose. Suddenly, a shriek echoed from the box, a sound that pierced the fabric of reality. The lid rattled, and the shadows grew restless, writhing in protest. "Do not falter," the leader commanded, and I could see determination in his eyes. "We must contain it." I watched in horror as the energy from the box erupted, a swirling vortex of darkness threatening to engulf everything around us. The candles flickered violently, and the very walls seemed to vibrate with the power of the entity trapped within. "Focus," the leader shouted, directing his energy toward the box. "You must join us. Channel your fear into strength." With trembling hands, I raised them toward the box, trying to summon any courage I had left. I thought of the souls I had seen, lost, trapped, crying for help. What had I unleashed? As I focused, the shadows began to swirl violently, and I could feel the weight of their despair pressing down on me. "What do you want?" I cried out, my voice breaking. "Freedom," the voice echoed again, desperate and angry. "Let them go!" I yelled, pouring every ounce of my fear and strength into the chant. The box shook violently, and the shadows surged, a dark tide threatening to drown us. But together, the keepers and I pushed back, channeling our energy into the box, creating a barrier against the darkness. As the battle intensified, I felt a surge of understanding. I wasn't just fighting for myself, I was fighting for the souls trapped within that darkness, for the ones who had suffered for too long. I pushed harder, my mind focused on freeing them, on sealing the door I had opened. With a final, ear-splitting shriek, the shadows converged into the box, and with a blinding flash of light, the lid slammed shut. Silence enveloped the church, a profound stillness settling over us. We stood there, panting, the weight of what had happened settling in. The leader approached me, his eyes filled with a mixture of respect and concern. "You have faced what many fear. But know this, the box is not destroyed. It remains a vessel, a reminder of what lies beyond. Keep it sealed." I nodded, feeling the gravity of my actions. "I will." As I left the church, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. I felt a mix of relief and sorrow. I had contained the darkness, but at what cost? The world felt different now, the ordinary tinged with an awareness of the unseen. I would always remember the box, the whispers, and the soul's yearning for freedom. The sun rose higher, illuminating my path, yet the shadows lingered at the edges of my vision, a reminder of the fragile balance between our world and the unknown. I would carry this experience with me, forever changed, aware that curiosity can lead to both enlightenment and despair. And in the quiet moments, when the shadows danced just out of sight, I would wonder if I had truly sealed the door, or if, one day, it might open again. The Shadow Man. Have you ever felt that unnerving sensation of being watched, even when you know you're alone? That subtle, creeping fear that crawls up your spine when the lights are dim and shadows seem just a bit too dark, a bit too real? It started innocently enough, as most things like this do. I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, let alone something as absurd as a shadow man. But reality, as I was about to learn, had far more in store for me than I ever imagined. The first time it happened, I dismissed it as stress. It was a typical evening, and I had just returned home after a long day of work. I live in a small, nondescript suburban house, a single-story structure tucked in a quiet neighborhood where nothing much ever happens. My routine was always the same: come home, drop my keys on the counter, kick off my shoes, and settle into the couch for a bit of mindless TV before bed. That night, though, as I entered the living room, something felt off. The air was heavy, like the stillness before a thunderstorm, though the weather outside was clear. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just fatigue. But when I sat down on the couch, a movement caught the corner of my eye. Just a flicker, quick and fleeting, like something shifting in the farthest edge of my peripheral vision. I turned my head toward the hallway, expecting to see nothing. But there was something there, lingering in the shadows near my bedroom door. It was tall, much taller than anyone I knew, a dark figure that stood motionless, as if watching me from the darkness. My heart skipped a beat. I blinked, convinced I was just tired, that my eyes were playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, it was gone. I laughed it off, nervously. It was just a shadow, nothing more. My brain must have been overworking, creating things out of nothing. After all, I had always heard that shadows could play tricks on you, especially when you're tired. So, I ignored it, turned off the lights, and went to bed. But sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in the corner of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. When I finally drifted off, it wasn't long before I was pulled into a dream, or rather, what felt like something far more sinister. In the dream, I was standing in my bedroom, but everything was darker. The room was the same, yet different in a way I couldn't describe. The air felt cold, and I could hear the faint sound of breathing, though I was alone. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't obey. That's when I saw him again, this time, clearer than before. The shadowy figure stood at the foot of my bed, watching me. He had no face, no features, nothing but a pitch-black silhouette. The darkness around him seemed to bend and twist, as if he was pulling it toward himself, drawing power from the shadows that surrounded him. I wanted to scream, to move, to do anything, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, trapped in my own mind. His presence filled the room, suffocating, oppressive. And then, without a sound, he started to move closer. I woke up in a cold sweat, gasping for air. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest, I thought it might explode. The room was dark, but I immediately reached for the lamp beside my bed, bathing the room in warm light. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the door, half expecting the figure to reappear. It was just a nightmare, I told myself. But the fear clung to me, even in the daylight. Over the next few days, things only got worse. Every time I entered a room, I felt as though someone, or something, was watching me. I would catch fleeting glimpses of the shadow man in mirrors, in darkened corners, in reflections on windows. Always there, but never fully in view. At work, I couldn't focus. My coworkers noticed, asking if I was all right, but what could I say? That I was being haunted by some faceless shadow? They would have thought I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. But I couldn't shake the feeling, couldn't get rid of the images burned into my brain. The dreams returned every night. Each time, the shadow man was closer, his presence heavier, more threatening. I could feel his cold breath on my skin, even though he never spoke, never touched me. But the fear, it was unbearable. I would wake up trembling, drenched in sweat, unable to breathe. One night, after another particularly vivid dream, I woke up to find myself standing in the middle of my living room. I had no memory of getting out of bed, no idea how I had ended up there. The only light came from the faint glow of the moon through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. And then I saw him, clear as day. He was standing just a few feet away from me, his form darker than the night itself, an empty, hollow figure. His head was tilted, as if he was studying me, and though I couldn't see his eyes, I knew he was staring right at me. This time, I didn't just feel fear. I felt a deep, gnawing dread, like something inside me was being pulled toward him, like he was waiting for me to do something, to make a mistake. The shadow man. Have you ever felt that unnerving sensation of being watched, even when you know you're alone? That subtle, creeping fear that crawls up your spine when the lights are dim and shadows seem just a bit too dark, a bit too real? It started innocently enough, as most things like this do. I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, let alone something as absurd as a shadow man. But reality, as I was about to learn, had far more in store for me than I ever imagined. The first time it happened, I dismissed it as stress. It was a typical evening, and I had just returned home after a long day of work. I live in a small, nondescript suburban house, a single-story structure tucked in a quiet neighborhood where nothing much ever happens. My routine was always the same: come home, drop my keys on the counter, kick off my shoes, and settle into the couch for a bit of mindless TV before bed. That night, though, as I entered the living room, something felt off. The air was heavy, like the stillness before a thunderstorm, though the weather outside was clear. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just fatigue. But when I sat down on the couch, a movement caught the corner of my eye. Just a flicker, quick and fleeting, like something shifting in the farthest edge of my peripheral vision. I turned my head toward the hallway, expecting to see nothing. But there was something there, lingering in the shadows near my bedroom door. It was tall, much taller than anyone I knew, a dark figure that stood motionless, as if watching me from the darkness. My heart skipped a beat. I blinked, convinced I was just tired, that my eyes were playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, it was gone. I laughed it off, nervously. It was just a shadow, nothing more. My brain must have been overworking, creating things out of nothing. After all, I had always heard that shadows could play tricks on you, especially when you're tired. So, I ignored it, turned off the lights, and went to bed. But sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in the corner of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. When I finally drifted off, it wasn't long before I was pulled into a dream, or rather, what felt like something far more sinister. In the dream, I was standing in my bedroom, but everything was darker. The room was the same, yet different in a way I couldn't describe. The air felt cold, and I could hear the faint sound of breathing, though I was alone. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't obey. That's when I saw him again, this time, clearer than before. The shadowy figure stood at the foot of my bed, watching me. He had no face, no features, nothing but a pitch-black silhouette. The darkness around him seemed to bend and twist, as if he was pulling it toward himself, drawing power from the shadows that surrounded him. I wanted to scream, to move, to do anything, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, trapped in my own mind. His presence filled the room, suffocating, oppressive. And then, without a sound, he started to move closer. I woke up in a cold sweat, gasping for air. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest, I thought it might explode. The room was dark, but I immediately reached for the lamp beside my bed, bathing the room in warm light. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the door, half expecting the figure to reappear. It was just a nightmare, I told myself. But the fear clung to me, even in the daylight. Over the next few days, things only got worse. Every time I entered a room, I felt as though someone, or something, was watching me. I would catch fleeting glimpses of the shadow man in mirrors, in darkened corners, in reflections on windows. Always there, but never fully in view. At work, I couldn't focus. My coworkers noticed, asking if I was all right, but what could I say? That I was being haunted by some faceless shadow? They would have thought I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. But I couldn't shake the feeling, couldn't get rid of the images burned into my brain. The dreams returned every night. Each time, the shadow man was closer, his presence heavier, more threatening. I could feel his cold breath on my skin, even though he never spoke, never touched me. But the fear, it was unbearable. I would wake up trembling, drenched in sweat, unable to breathe. One night, after another particularly vivid dream, I woke up to find myself standing in the middle of my living room. I had no memory of getting out of bed, no idea how I had ended up there. The only light came from the faint glow of the moon through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. And then I saw him, clear as day. He was standing just a few feet away from me, his form darker than the night itself, an empty, hollow figure. His head was tilted, as if he was studying me, and though I couldn't see his eyes, I knew he was staring right at me. This time, I didn't just feel fear. I felt a deep, gnawing dread, like something inside me was being pulled toward him, like he was waiting for me to do something, to make a mistake. The lights in the hallway flickered. Just for a moment, but long enough for my breath to catch in my throat. I stared at the darkened hallway, my heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. And then, there he was, standing at the end of the hallway, his form blending into the shadows, but unmistakable. This time, he was closer than ever before, his presence suffocating, as though the air around him was being sucked into a void. I stood up, gripping the edge of the coffee table for support, my legs trembling. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of the house, but something inside me kept me frozen in place. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched, like he was waiting for me to make the first move. I swallowed, my throat dry, and took a step forward. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Why are you here?" The shadow man didn't respond. But this time, something was different. I could feel his presence more strongly than ever before, like he was inside my mind, sifting through my thoughts, my memories. A wave of nausea washed over me, and I stumbled back, clutching my head. And then, just as before, he was gone. I was left standing in the hallway, my breath ragged, my body trembling. But something had changed. This time, I felt as though he had left something behind, something dark, something that had burrowed its way into my mind and soul. For days after that night, I felt different, as if a part of me had been touched by something foreign, something that wasn't supposed to be there. The air in my house felt thicker, heavier. It was as if the walls themselves were watching me. I couldn't shake the sense of being observed, even when I was alone. The quiet moments, once comforting, now felt suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of light, sent my heart racing. The shadow man hadn't shown himself since that night in the hallway, but I knew he was still there. I could feel him. Sometimes, while I was lying in bed at night, I'd hear faint footsteps outside my door, soft, deliberate. But every time I got up to check, there was nothing. The worst part was that no one seemed to believe me. I confided in a few close friends, but their reactions were what I had feared, sympathetic smiles, followed by dismissive reassurances that I was just tired, stressed, maybe working too much. "You're just seeing things," they'd say. "It's all in your head." But it wasn't. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. I even considered seeing a therapist, thinking that maybe I really was losing my mind. But what could I say? That I was being haunted by a shadow that followed me from my dreams into the real world? They prescribed me medication and sent me on my way, chalking it up to hallucinations or sleep deprivation. It was getting harder to function. My days were a blur of exhaustion, and my nights were plagued by the same dream, if you could call it a dream. Every night, I found myself in that darkened version of my house, standing in the shadows, unable to move. And every night, the shadow man was there, closer and closer. Each time, I felt his cold presence more intensely, like a chill seeping into my bones. He never spoke, never touched me. But I knew he was getting stronger, more real. I started avoiding the house, spending more time at work, staying late just to avoid going home. I even tried sleeping in my car a few nights, but it didn't help. No matter where I went, the dreams followed. I'd wake up in the driver's seat, drenched in sweat, with the image of his dark form still fresh in my mind. It was a Saturday evening when I decided I had enough. I couldn't go on living like this. I had to confront him, whatever he was. There had to be a way to stop this, to make it all end. I spent hours scouring the internet, looking for answers, for anything that could help me understand what I was dealing with. That's when I stumbled upon an obscure forum, buried deep in the dark corners of the web. It was a place for people like me, people who had seen things, experienced things they couldn't explain. I read through post after post, and the stories were eerily similar to mine: shadowy figures, sleep paralysis, an overwhelming sense of dread. Some called them shadow people, others referred to them as manifestations of the subconscious, feeding off fear and negative energy. One post, in particular, stood out. It was written by someone who claimed to have banished a shadow figure from their life. The key, they said, was to confront it head on. They thrive on fear, the post read. The more you fear them, the stronger they become. But if you face them, stand your ground, they lose their power. I wasn't sure if I believed it. But at that point, I was willing to try anything. The thought of confronting the shadow man terrified me, but I knew I couldn't keep living like this. That night, I made a decision. I would face him. I would stay awake until he appeared, and this time, I wouldn't run. I wouldn't hide. I would demand answers. I'd get my life back. I sat in my living room, every light in the house turned off. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the streetlight outside, casting long, twisted shadows across the room. My heart was pounding, and my hands trembled as I waited, the silence thick and oppressive. Midnight passed. Then 1 o'clock. 2. My eyelids grew heavy, but I fought the urge to sleep. I had to stay awake. I couldn't risk slipping into another dream, into his world. At 3 a.m., the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The air felt colder, sharper, and I knew he was coming. I held my breath, gripping the armrest of the couch, my body tense for what I knew was inevitable. The lights in the hallway flickered. Just for a moment, but long enough for my breath to catch in my throat. I stared at the darkened hallway, my heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. And then, there he was, standing at the end of the hallway, his form blending into the shadows, but unmistakable. This time, he was closer than ever before, his presence suffocating, as though the air around him was being sucked into a void. I stood up, gripping the edge of the coffee table for support, my legs trembling. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of the house, but something inside me kept me frozen in place. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched, like he was waiting for me to make the first move. I swallowed, my throat dry, and took a step forward. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Why are you here?" The shadow man didn't respond. But this time, something was different. I could feel his presence more strongly than ever before, like he was inside my mind, sifting through my thoughts, my memories. A wave of nausea washed over me, and I stumbled back, clutching my head. And then, just as before, he was gone. I was left standing in the hallway, my breath ragged, my body trembling. But something had changed. This time, I felt as though he had left something behind, something dark, something that had burrowed its way into my mind and soul. For days after that night, I felt different, as if a part of me had been touched by something foreign, something that wasn't supposed to be there. The air in my house felt thicker, heavier. It was as if the walls themselves were watching me. I couldn't shake the sense of being observed, even while I was alone. The quiet moments, once comforting, now felt suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of light, sent my heart racing. The shadow man hadn't shown himself since that night in the hallway, but I knew he was still there. I could feel him. Sometimes, while I was lying in bed at night, I'd hear faint footsteps outside my door, soft, deliberate. But every time I got up to check, there was nothing. The worst part was that no one seemed to believe me. I confided in a few close friends, but their reactions were what I had feared, sympathetic smiles, followed by dismissive reassurances that I was just tired, stressed, maybe working too much. "You're just seeing things," they'd say. "It's all in your head." But it wasn't. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. I even considered seeing a therapist, thinking that maybe I really was losing my mind. But what could I say? That I was being haunted by a shadow that followed me from my dreams into the real world? They prescribed me medication and sent me on my way, chalking it up to hallucinations or sleep deprivation. It was getting harder to function. My days were a blur of exhaustion, and my nights were plagued by the same dream, if you could call it a dream. Every night, I found myself in that darkened version of my house, standing in the shadows, unable to move. And every night, the shadow man was there, closer and closer. Each time, I felt his cold presence more intensely, like a chill seeping into my bones. He never spoke, never touched me. But I knew he was getting stronger, more real. I started avoiding the house, spending more time at work, staying late just to avoid going home. I even tried sleeping in my car a few nights, but it didn't help. No matter where I went, the dreams followed. I'd wake up in the driver's seat, drenched in sweat, with the image of his dark form still fresh in my mind. It was a Saturday evening when I decided I had enough. I couldn't go on living like this. I had to confront him, whatever he was. There had to be a way to stop this, to make it all end. I spent hours scouring the internet, looking for answers, for anything that could help me understand what I was dealing with. That's when I stumbled upon an obscure forum, buried deep in the dark corners of the web. It was a place for people like me, people who had seen things, experienced things they couldn't explain. I read through post after post, and the stories were eerily similar to mine: shadowy figures, sleep paralysis, an overwhelming sense of dread. Some called them shadow people, others referred to them as manifestations of the subconscious, feeding off fear and negative energy. One post, in particular, stood out. It was written by someone who claimed to have banished a shadow figure from their life. The key, they said, was to confront it head on. They thrive on fear, the post read. The more you fear them, the stronger they become. But if you face them, stand your ground, they lose their power. I wasn't sure if I believed it. But at that point, I was willing to try anything. The thought of confronting the shadow man terrified me, but I knew I couldn't keep living like this. That night, I made a decision. I would face him. I would stay awake until he appeared, and this time, I wouldn't run. I wouldn't hide. I would demand answers. I'd get my life back. I sat in my living room, every light in the house turned off. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the streetlight outside, casting long, twisted shadows across the room. My heart was pounding, and my hands trembled as I waited, the silence thick and oppressive. Midnight passed. Then 1 o'clock. 2. My eyelids grew heavy, but I fought the urge to sleep. I had to stay awake. I couldn't risk slipping into another dream, into his world. At 3 a.m., the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The air felt colder, sharper, and I knew he was coming. I held my breath, gripping the armrest of the couch, my body tense for what I knew was inevitable. The door creaked open, revealing a darkness so thick it seemed to swallow the light. It wasn't just an absence of light, it was a void, a nothingness that felt alive, pulsing with an energy that chilled me to my core. I stared into the blackness, my heart pounding, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. A voice echoed from the darkness, soft at first, then growing louder, more insistent. It wasn't words, exactly, but a low, guttural sound that filled the air, vibrating through my body. I felt a pull, stronger than anything I'd ever experienced, drawing me toward the abyss. And then, I woke up. I was back in my bed, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The room was quiet, still, but the sense of dread lingered. I could still feel the pull of the door, the darkness, as though a part of me had been left behind in the dream. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The following day, I couldn't stop thinking about the door. It was just a dream, I told myself. It wasn't real. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that something had changed. The shadow man wasn't the same. His presence felt different, more powerful, more invasive. And I knew, deep down, that the door was the key. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me, something worse than the shadow man, something that had been lurking in the background all along, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. That evening, as I sat in my living room, staring into the shadows, I made a decision. I couldn't keep running. I had to face whatever was waiting for me, whatever was on the other side of that door. I didn't know what I would find, but I knew I couldn't keep living like this. The fear was consuming me, eating away at my sanity, and I couldn't let it win. So I waited. As the hours passed, the house grew darker, the shadows lengthening as the night deepened. The clock ticked closer to midnight, and I felt the familiar chill in the air. He was coming. At exactly 3 a.m., the lights flickered, and I knew the moment had arrived. I stood up, my heart pounding, and made my way down the hallway. The air was thick with anticipation, and I could feel the shadow man watching me, his presence pressing in on all sides. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I was determined. When I reached the end of the hallway, I stopped. The door was there, just as it had been in my dream, old, worn, and pulsing with that same dark energy. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, but I didn't hesitate. I turned it and pushed the door open. The darkness on the other side was just as thick, just as suffocating as I remembered. But this time, I wasn't afraid of it. I stepped through the doorway, into the abyss. And the door closed behind me. The moment the door clicked shut behind me, the air changed. The thick, oppressive darkness felt heavier, almost solid, as though it was wrapping itself around me, pulling me deeper into its void. I stood still for a moment, trying to steady my breath, listening to the deafening silence. There was no going back now. The house, my life, everything that existed outside this door felt like a distant memory. This place, whatever it was, had swallowed me whole. I couldn't see anything. The darkness was impenetrable, pressing in on me from every side, making it impossible to tell where the floor ended and the air began. My instinct screamed at me to run, to claw my way back to the door, but I forced myself to stay calm. I was here for a reason, but I wasn't sure what that reason was anymore. I wasn't sure of anything, except that the shadow man had led me here, and I needed answers. I took a cautious step forward, half expecting the ground to vanish beneath my feet. But it held, cold and solid, beneath me. I took another step, and then another, each one slower than the last, feeling my way through the thick blackness. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound deafening in the eerie silence. And then I heard it. A faint whisper, barely more than a breath, coming from somewhere deep within the void. It was distant, but it sent a shiver down my spine, freezing me in place. It was the same guttural voice I had heard in my dream, the one that had called to me from the darkness. But this time, it was clearer, more distinct, as though it was getting closer. I stood still, straining to hear, but the whisper faded, replaced by an unnatural silence. I was about to move again when I felt it, a presence, something cold and malevolent, watching me from the darkness. My skin prickled, and I knew, without seeing, that the shadow man was here. He had followed me, Or maybe I had followed him. My throat tightened as the air around me grew colder, the darkness thickening until it felt like I was drowning in it. I could feel him getting closer, his presence wrapping itself around me, suffocating me. But this time, I didn't run. I couldn't. There was nowhere to run to. "Show yourself," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the thick air. "I'm not afraid of you." It was a lie, of course. I was terrified. But I had to face him. I had to know what he wanted, why he had been haunting me, pulling me into this nightmare. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, and then, out of the darkness, I saw it, movement. A shape, faint at first, but growing more distinct, slowly forming out of the void. The Shadow Man. He was exactly as I remembered, tall, featureless, his form nothing more than an absence of light, a darkness that seemed to bend the very air around him. He stood just a few feet away, unmoving, his faceless head tilted slightly as though studying me. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze, or where his gaze would have been. The cold radiated off him, chilling me to my core, but I stood my ground. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Why are you here?" For a moment, there was nothing. And then, slowly, deliberately, the Shadow Man raised his arm, pointing behind me. I turned, following the direction of his gesture, and for the first time, I saw something in the darkness. It was a light. Faint, distant, but unmistakable, a single point of light, hovering in the void, like a beacon in the night. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it, a strange sense of recognition washing over me. I didn't know how, but I knew that light. It felt familiar, as though I had seen it before, in another life, another time. I turned back to the Shadow Man, my heart racing. He hadn't moved, but I could feel the weight of his presence pressing down on me, urging me forward. He wanted me to follow the light. But why? What was waiting for me on the other side? My mind raced with questions, but there were no answers. Only the cold, empty void and the light pulsing in the distance. I took a deep breath and started walking toward it. The closer I got, the more the darkness seemed to recede, the air growing less oppressive, lighter. The light grew brighter with each step, casting long shadows across the void. But as I neared, I realized that something was wrong. The light wasn't what I thought it was. It wasn't a beacon. It wasn't an escape. It was a door. The same door I had walked through earlier, only now it was floating in the middle of the void, glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. I stopped a few feet away, my heart pounding in my chest, staring at the door in disbelief. This wasn't possible. I had come through this door. How could it be here, now, in the middle of nowhere? I hesitated, unsure of what to do. The Shadow Man hadn't followed me. He remained in the distance, his form barely visible in the blackness. I was alone with the door. Slowly, I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the handle. The cold metal sent a shock through my body, but I didn't pull away. I turned the handle, and the door creaked open. What I saw on the other side made my blood run cold. It was my house. But it wasn't my house. Not exactly. It was a twisted, distorted version of it, like something out of a nightmare. The walls were warped, the furniture was broken, the air thick with the stench of decay. And there, standing in the middle of the room, was the Shadow Man. But this wasn't the Shadow Man I had seen before. This one was different. He was darker, more solid, his form more defined. He wasn't just a shadow anymore. He was something else, something far more dangerous. I stumbled back, my heart racing, as the shadow man stepped forward, his dark form filling the doorway. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear, as he loomed over me, his cold presence wrapping around me like a vice. And then, without warning, he spoke. His voice was a low, guttural rasp, like the sound of wind through dead trees. "You cannot escape," he whispered, the words echoing in the darkness. "You belong to me." A chill ran down my spine as the words sank in. This wasn't just a nightmare. This was real. And there was no waking up from it. The shadow man reached out, his hand, or what passed for a hand, closing around my wrist. His touch was cold, colder than anything I had ever felt, and it burned like ice against my skin. I gasped, trying to pull away, but his grip was unbreakable. "You will never leave," he rasped, his voice a twisted mockery of human speech. "You are mine." The darkness closed in around me, suffocating, crushing, until I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was scream. And then everything went black. I woke up to the sound of silence, my throat raw from screaming. My body ached, my limbs felt heavy, and a cold sweat clung to my skin. For a moment, I didn't know where I was, if I was still trapped in the darkness with the shadow man, or if I had somehow escaped. But as my vision cleared, I realized I was back in my bedroom. The familiar, comforting sight of my worn-out bed, the soft glow of the morning sun peeking through the curtains, and the distant hum of traffic outside filled my senses. It was as if nothing had happened, as if the nightmare had never existed. I sat up, my heart still pounding, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I tried to convince myself that it had all been a dream, just another one of the twisted hallucinations that had plagued me for so long. But the icy burn on my wrist said otherwise. I looked down and froze. There, on my skin, was a faint, dark bruise in the shape of a handprint. A wave of nausea washed over me. My stomach churned, and I stumbled out of bed, rushing to the bathroom. I barely made it to the sink before I vomited, the sour taste of bile filling my mouth. I clung to the porcelain, my mind spinning with fear, disbelief, and the growing certainty that something terrible was happening to me. The shadow man was real. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to steady my breath, trying to calm the panic that threatened to swallow me whole. But the fear gnawed at me, an insidious presence that I couldn't shake. I couldn't stay here. I needed help. I needed answers. I grabbed my phone and dialed the one person I could trust, my aunt. She answered after the third ring, her familiar, comforting voice filling the line. "Hey, are you all right?" "You sound off," she said, her concern evident even through the phone. I didn't know how to explain it all to her, the nightmares, the shadow man, the bruise on my wrist. It sounded insane, but I had no choice. If anyone would understand, it was her. I don't know what's happening," I stammered. "I think I'm being haunted." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I thought she might hang up. But when she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost hesitant. "You've seen him, haven't you? The man in the shadows." My blood ran cold. How could she know? "Yes," I whispered. "How do you?" "I've seen him too," she interrupted, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "A long time ago. I was your age, maybe a little older. He appeared in my dreams, then in real life. just like with you. I clutched the phone tighter, my heart pounding in my chest. What did you want? What happened to you? She hesitated, and when she finally spoke, there was a tremor in her voice. I tried to escape him, but he always found me. He tormented me for years, haunting my every move until her voice cracked. I had to leave everything behind. I moved far away, changed my name, cut ties with everyone. It was the only way to be free of him. My mind reeled. Could that be the answer? To run, to leave everything behind like she had? But even as the thought crossed my mind, I knew it wasn't that simple. The shadow man wasn't bound by distance or time. He was something else, something far more terrifying. How did it stop? I asked, my voice barely audible. It didn't, she said softly. Not really. I still feel him sometimes, lurking just out of sight. But as long as I don't acknowledge him, as long as I don't think about him, he stays away. He feeds on fear, on attention. The more you fear him, the stronger he becomes. Her words sent a chill down my spine. I realized then that I had been feeding him for years, through my fear, through my desperate attempts to understand him. I had given him power over me. But what can I do? I asked, my voice cracking with desperation. I can't just ignore him. He's always there. I don't know, she admitted, her voice heavy with regret. I wish I had a better answer. All I can tell you is to be careful. Don't let him consume you. The call ended with a hollow click, leaving me standing in the bathroom, clutching my phone like a lifeline. My aunt had lived with this nightmare for years, and now it was mine to bear. The weight of it settled on my chest like a stone, suffocating me with the hopelessness of it all. I couldn't run. I couldn't hide. The shadow man was with me now, and there was no escaping him. The day passed in a haze, each moment a struggle to keep myself grounded in reality. I tried to go about my usual routine, but everything felt wrong. Every shadow seemed darker, every creak in the floorboards more sinister. The world around me had shifted, tainted by his presence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. By the time night fell, my nerves were frayed, my body exhausted, but I knew sleep was the last thing I wanted. That was when he would come again, in the dead of night, when my mind was at its weakest. But I couldn't stay awake forever. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding with every creak of the house. My aunt's words echoed in my mind, a warning and a curse. Don't let him consume you. I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold out. Every night, he was getting closer, stronger, feeding off my fear, my anxiety. And I could feel myself slipping, losing my grip on reality. Was any of this even real? Or had I gone mad, lost in a delusion of my own making? The clock ticked on, each minute stretching into eternity, until finally, exhaustion overtook me, and I slipped into a restless sleep. That's when the dream started again. But this time, it wasn't the same void, the same shadowy figure. This time, I was in my childhood home, the one my aunt had lived in before she disappeared. The house was dark and empty, the walls stripped bare, the furniture covered in dust. But it was unmistakable. I knew this place. I wandered through the familiar rooms, my heart heavy with the memories of a time long gone. But something was wrong. The air was thick with a suffocating tension, and I could feel him, watching, waiting, lurking in the shadows. I walked into the living room, and there he was, standing in the corner, his dark form barely visible in the dim light. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched me, his presence a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in his gaze, unable to break free. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls bending and warping like the house in my nightmares. And then he spoke again. "You belong to me." His voice was a low growl, the sound reverberating through the room, shaking me to my core. I wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything to break free, but I was powerless. "You cannot escape." His words echoed in my mind, drilling into my consciousness, pushing me further into despair. I felt his presence growing stronger, suffocating me. The walls around me seemed to close in as if the entire world was shrinking, trapping me in this endless nightmare. And then, just as suddenly, everything stopped. The room fell silent, the pressure lifted, and I could move again. I stumbled backward, gasping for air, my heart racing in my chest. But he was still there, standing in the corner, watching me with those hollow, empty eyes. I don't know what came over me in that moment, whether it was desperation or defiance, but something inside me snapped. I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't let him control me, consume me. If I was going to survive, I had to face him. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling, but growing stronger with each word. "You don't own me." For a moment, the shadow man didn't react. He just stood there, silent and still. But then, slowly, he began to move, stepping out of the corner and toward me. The room seemed to darken with each step he took, the air growing colder, thicker. I wanted to run, but I forced myself to stand my ground. My aunt's words rang in my ears. "He feeds on fear." I couldn't let him win. I couldn't let him see the terror that gripped me, even though it threatened to swallow me whole. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, though the light tasted bitter on my tongue. He stopped, just inches from me, his shadowy form looming over me like a dark cloud. His presence was overwhelming, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. But I refused to back down. I stared into the void where his face should have been, trying to meet his gaze, even though I couldn't see his eyes. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, locked in a silent standoff. And then, without warning, he vanished. The room was suddenly empty. The oppressive weight lifted, the air cleared, and I was alone. I collapsed onto the floor, my body trembling, my mind reeling from what had just happened. I had faced him, confronted him, and he had disappeared. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The days that followed were strange, almost surreal. The shadow man didn't appear again, at least not in the way he had before. But his presence lingered, like a dark cloud hanging over my life. Every shadow, every flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye sent a jolt of fear through me. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching, waiting. I tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, to go about my life as if everything was fine. But nothing felt normal anymore. The world seemed different, darker, more dangerous. I was constantly on edge, jumping at every sound, every unexpected movement. Sleep was still a distant memory, and when I did manage to drift off, the nightmares were always there, lurking in the background, waiting to pull me back into the darkness. I reached out to my aunt again, desperate for some kind of guidance, some way to make sense of what was happening to me. But she didn't answer my calls. I tried again and again, but it was as if she had vanished. Panic began to set in. Had something happened to her? Had the shadow man finally found her again? The thought made my stomach churn with dread. I couldn't lose her. She was the only person who understood, the only one who had been through this nightmare and survived. I had to find her. I made the drive to her house in a daze, my mind racing with fear and uncertainty. When I finally arrived, the house was dark and quiet, the curtains drawn tightly shut. I knocked on the door, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no answer. I called her name, pounded on the door, but still nothing. The silence was deafening. I didn't know what to do. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, like the world was closing in on me, just as it had in my dreams. Desperation clawed at my throat, making it hard to breathe. And then, from behind me, I heard a voice. "You won't find her." I spun around, my blood turning to ice. There, standing in the middle of the street, was the shadow man. But this time, he wasn't alone. Beside him, standing just as still, just as silent, was my aunt. Her eyes were wide, her face pale, her body rigid like a statue. But there was something off about her, something unnatural. It was as if she wasn't really there, as if she were a puppet, controlled by invisible strings. "Auntie!" I called out, my voice cracking with fear. But she didn't respond. She didn't even blink. The shadow man stepped forward, his dark form almost blending into the night. His voice, when he spoke, was cold, devoid of any emotion. "She's mine now, just like you will be." A wave of cold terror washed over me, paralyzing me where I stood. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape, but my body wouldn't respond. I was trapped, just like she was. The shadow man reached out, his hand extending toward me, and I felt the familiar cold seeping into my skin, pulling me into the darkness. My vision blurred, my mind spun, and I knew I was losing. But then, just as his hand touched mine, something shifted. A spark of defiance flared within me, a surge of anger and determination that I hadn't felt before. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But it was enough. I pulled away from his grasp, stumbling back, my body shaking with the effort. The shadow man recoiled, his form flickering as if my resistance had weakened him. I didn't know how or why, but for the first time, I felt like I had a chance. I wasn't going to let him take me. I wasn't going to let him win. I stood in the street, my legs trembling, my body weak from the struggle. The shadow man was still there, hovering in the darkness like a predator waiting for the kill, but he wasn't as strong as before. Something had changed. I could feel it in the air, a shift in the balance of power. He stepped forward again, his hand outstretched, but this time I didn't back away. I couldn't let him control me any longer. I had to end this. "You can't take me," I said, my voice low but steady. "Not anymore." The shadow man froze, his form flickering like a dying flame. He didn't speak, but I could feel his frustration, his anger. I had defied him, broken the fear that had fueled his power. And he didn't know what to do. I glanced at my aunt, who still stood motionless by his side. Her eyes were vacant, her body stiff, but there was something there, something fragile, a faint flicker of life behind the emptiness. She hadn't been consumed completely. Not yet. If I could save myself, maybe I could save her too. I took a step toward her, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadow man moved to block my path, but I didn't stop. I kept walking, kept pushing forward, even as the cold seeped into my skin, even as his presence pressed down on me like a heavy weight. "You don't own me," I said again, louder this time. "You don't own her." The shadow man let out a low, guttural growl, his form rippling with anger. But he didn't move. He couldn't. I reached my aunt, placing a hand on her cold, lifeless arm. Her skin felt like ice, but I didn't let go. I squeezed her hand, hoping that somewhere inside, she could still hear me. "Auntie," I whispered. "Come back. Don't let him take you." For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. She remained still, unresponsive, her eyes fixed on the distance. But then, slowly, she blinked. Her fingers twitched in my hand, and a faint breath escaped her lips. She was still there. The shadow man hissed, his form twisting and warping as if he was losing control. His power was fading, slipping away as I held onto my aunt, refusing to let him take her. "You can't win," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "You're nothing without our fear. And we're not afraid anymore." He let out a terrible, inhuman scream, his form dissolving into the darkness. The shadows that had surrounded us began to fade, the suffocating cold lifting as the night returned to its natural stillness. I held my breath, waiting for him to return, waiting for the nightmare to start again. But the street was empty. He was gone. My aunt collapsed into my arms, her body weak and trembling. I held her close, tears streaming down my face as the relief washed over me. We had done it. We had beaten him. In the days that followed, things slowly returned to normal. My aunt recovered, though she remained quiet and withdrawn, haunted by the memories of what had happened. But the shadow man was gone. He no longer haunted my dreams, no longer watched me from the corners of my vision. It was over. Or at least, I thought it was. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something strange in the mirror. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the lamp on my nightstand. But as I looked closer, my blood ran cold. There, in the reflection, standing just behind me, was the shadow man. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but the room was empty. There was no one there. I turned back to the mirror, and he was gone. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. He was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for his chance to return. Because the truth is, you can never truly escape the darkness. It's always there, just out of sight, watching, waiting. And one day, when you least expect it, it will come for you again. The entity from the old mine. Have you ever felt like something was watching you when there was no one around? That feeling had haunted me ever since the day we entered the old mine. It started as an ordinary research project. Our team, 5 experienced geologists, was hired to explore the abandoned mining site in the middle of nowhere. On paper, it was a straightforward job: document the condition of the tunnels, gather geological samples, and ensure the area was safe before the land was developed. But something didn't sit right with me from the start. The mine had been shut down for decades after a series of accidents claimed several lives. Rumors of hauntings and strange occurrences surrounded it, but we dismissed them as local superstition. Rational minds always find a way to explain the unexplainable, right? At least, that's what I told myself. We were professionals, after all. Science had the answers. Or so I believed. It was a long drive to the site, the road becoming increasingly narrow as the forest thickened. The town we passed through, if you could call it a town, was a desolate string of crumbling houses and shuttered shops. The few locals we encountered gave us odd looks, and when we mentioned the mine, their expressions grew grim. One older man even muttered something under his breath, something about waking things best left asleep. I laughed it off at the time. We all did. But looking back, I wonder if he knew more than we gave him credit for. When we finally arrived, the entrance to the mine was even more foreboding than I had expected. The wooden beams holding up the mouth of the tunnel were weathered and splintered, the ground covered in layers of dirt and decaying leaves. A heavy, musty smell lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of damp stone and rusted metal. "This place gives me the creeps," Sarah, one of our team members, said as we unpacked our gear. She wasn't usually one to get spooked easily, but there was something about the mine that unsettled her. "You're not the only one," Greg replied. He was our lead geologist, a no-nonsense type who rarely showed emotion. Yet even he seemed on edge. As we prepared to enter, I found myself lingering at the entrance, staring into the darkness. My headlamp illuminated only a small section of the tunnel, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and dance at the edges of my vision. For a brief moment, I could have sworn I saw movement deeper inside, just a flicker, like something darting out of sight. But when I blinked, it was gone. "Everything okay, man?" Alex, the youngest member of our team, slapped me on the back, startling me out of my thoughts. "Yeah, fine," I said, but my voice felt too thin, too forced. "Let's get this over with," Greg called out, already halfway into the tunnel. The rest of us followed, our footsteps echoing against the stone walls. The deeper we went, the colder it became. It was an unnatural cold, biting through our layers of clothing. The kind that settles in your bones and refuses to let go. But worse than the cold was the silence. Every now and then, we would stop to listen, hearing only the faint dripping of water and the occasional creak of the wooden supports overhead. There was something oppressive about the air down there. I could feel it pressing against my chest, making it harder to breathe. I tried to shake the feeling, focusing on the task at hand, but it lingered in the back of my mind like a shadow I couldn't quite escape. "Watch your step," Greg warned as we descended deeper into the mine. The tunnel sloped downward, and the ground beneath us became more uneven, littered with debris from old mining equipment. I felt the weight of the earth above us, the solid mass of rock pressing down as if the mine itself was trying to swallow us whole. After what felt like hours, we reached a section that hadn't been on any of the maps. It was a dead-end chamber, larger than the others we had passed through, with strange symbols carved into the walls. They were crude, almost primitive, but there was something about them that made my skin crawl. Sarah ran her fingers over one of the carvings, her brow furrowing. "Do these look recent to you?" she asked, her voice echoing unnervingly in the silence. Greg shrugged. "Could be. Or they could be from the original miners. Who knows?" I didn't think they looked recent, but I didn't say anything. The lines were too precise, too deliberate, as if whoever had made them had done so with purpose. And the shapes, they weren't like anything I had ever seen before. Just then, a gust of cold air rushed through the chamber, making the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I instinctively turned, my headlamp cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Only shadows. We continued our work, taking measurements and documenting the state of the tunnels, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. It was as if the very walls had eyes, observing us from just beyond the reach of our lights. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was lurking in the dark, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. It wasn't until we decided to leave that things took a turn for the worse. As we retraced our steps, the ground beneath us began to tremble. At first, it was barely noticeable, a faint vibration that could have been anything. But then the tremors intensified, growing stronger with each passing second. Is that an earthquake? Alex asked, his voice trembling as much as the ground. No, it's not seismic, Greg said, his face pale. At least, it shouldn't be. Suddenly, there was a deafening crack, followed by the sound of rocks crashing down behind us. We spun around to see the tunnel collapsing, sealing off the way we had come. Panic surged through the group. We need to move, now! Greg shouted, but as we turned to run, we realized we had nowhere to go. The tunnel ahead of us had collapsed as well, trapping us in the chamber with the strange symbols. Trapped, with no way out. And that's when we heard it, the sound. It was faint at first, like a low rumble coming from deep within the earth. But it grew louder, closer, until it became a guttural growl that echoed off the walls. Something was down here with us. Something alive. Or worse, something not alive at all. The growl reverberated through the chamber, so deep and unnatural it felt like the very air around us vibrated in response. My heart raced, pounding in my ears, drowning out everything except the sound of that thing. I could see the fear in everyone's eyes. We had all heard it, felt it. And even though none of us wanted to admit it, we knew something was down here with us. We need to find another way out, Greg said, his voice steadier than I expected, but I could tell he was just as terrified as the rest of us. Everyone, stay close. We hurried toward the far end of the chamber, where an old, rusted ladder led upward toward what looked like an even narrower tunnel. As Greg climbed first to check its stability, I glanced back toward the collapsed entrance. There was no light, no movement, just an oppressive, suffocating darkness. But that feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond my line of sight, had intensified. Come on, man, Alex urged, already halfway up the ladder. Don't stand there. I forced myself to follow, gripping the cold metal rungs with shaky hands. The ladder creaked under our combined weight, but it held, leading us up into a tight, narrow passage barely wide enough to fit through. It felt like the walls were closing in, the air thicker and harder to breathe the higher we climbed. Where does this lead? Sarah asked, her voice a low whisper that echoed ominously in the tight space. No idea, Greg responded from above, his voice strained as he pulled himself up. But it's better than staying down there. I wasn't so sure. The growling had faded, but that didn't mean we were safe. In fact, the silence was somehow worse. It felt like the mine itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. After what seemed like an eternity, we reached the top of the ladder and found ourselves in another small chamber. It was different from the others, less worn down, less decayed. In fact, it looked almost untouched by time. The walls were smooth, the floor unnervingly clean. And at the far end of the chamber, there was something odd, a narrow opening, barely large enough for a person to crawl through. I'm not going in there, Sarah said immediately, her eyes wide with panic. No way. Greg hesitated. It's our only option. The tunnel collapsed behind us. We all stood there for a moment, staring at the narrow gap in the wall. Something about it felt wrong, like it wasn't supposed to be there. It didn't look natural, almost as if it had been carved recently, and with a purpose we couldn't understand. We don't have a choice, I said, my voice hoarse. We need to keep moving. Greg nodded, taking the lead once again as he crouched down and crawled through the opening. One by one, we followed, the claustrophobic space pressing on us from all sides. My shoulders scraped against the walls, and every breath felt shallow, labored. It was like crawling through the very earth itself. As we moved deeper into the passage, the temperature dropped even further. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the cold bit into my skin like needles. I wanted to ask if anyone else felt it, but the words died in my throat. There was something in the air, a tension, a heaviness that made speaking feel dangerous. Like breaking the silence would invite something we didn't want to face. It wasn't long before we emerged into another chamber, but this one was unlike any we had seen before. The walls were lined with old wooden beams, but they were carved with more of those strange symbols, the same ones we had seen in the first chamber, but here they were more elaborate, more intricate. They seemed to pulsate in the dim light of our headlamps, as though they were alive, shifting and moving in ways that defied logic. "What the hell is this?" Alex asked, his voice shaky. No one answered. At the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, covered in a thick layer of dust. But the thing that caught my attention, grabbed my attention, was what lay on the altar, an old, withered book. Its cover was cracked and faded, the pages yellowed with age. But even from a distance, I could see that the symbols on the cover matched the ones carved into the walls. "Don't touch it," Sarah whispered, backing away from the altar. "We shouldn't be here." But Greg was already approaching it. "We need to understand what's happening here," he said, his hand hovering over the book. "This might tell us something. Or it could make things worse," I muttered, but he either didn't hear me or didn't care. He opened the book. I'm not sure what I was expecting, some ancient, illegible language, maybe. But what I saw was worse. The pages were filled with diagrams, grotesque, twisted images of figures that didn't look quite human, standing in strange formations, surrounded by symbols. And there were words too, written in a language I couldn't recognize, but that felt wrong. Just looking at them made my skin crawl, like the letters themselves were somehow alive, writhing on the page. "I don't like this," Sarah said again, her voice trembling. "Me neither," Alex added, stepping back. "We should go. Now." But Greg was transfixed, his eyes glued to the pages. I could see the way his fingers trembled as he flipped through the book, his breathing shallow. "Greg," I said, more forcefully this time. "We need to leave. Now." He looked up at me, and for the first time since we entered the mine, I saw real fear in his eyes. He nodded, snapping the book shut. But as he did, something changed. The air around us seemed to thicken, the temperature dropping even lower. And then we heard it again. The growl. But this time, it was closer. Much closer. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Sarah and pulling her toward the opening we had crawled through. We scrambled back into the narrow passage, our headlamps flickering as we moved as fast as we could through the tight space. But the growl followed us, growing louder, more guttural with each passing second. I could feel the vibrations in the ground, in the walls, as though whatever was making that sound was right behind us. We reached the ladder and began climbing, my heart pounding in my chest. The metal rungs felt slick under my hands, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But the growling didn't stop. It was coming for us, getting closer and closer. By the time we reached the top, the chamber we had left behind felt like a distant memory. We were back in the main tunnel, gasping for air, the oppressive silence replaced by the sound of our own panicked breaths. But we weren't safe. We weren't out. Because whatever had followed us was still down there. And it wasn't done with us yet. Have you ever felt true terror? The kind that seeps into your bones, that makes every breath feel like a mistake? That's what gripped us now, as we stood in the cold, dark tunnel, knowing that the thing below us wasn't finished. My hands still trembled from the climb, the weight of the unknown pressing down on my chest like an anchor. Greg, usually so composed, looked shaken. His knuckles were white as he gripped the flashlight. "We need to move," he said, his voice low, strained. "Get as far away from here as possible." None of us argued. There was no room for debate anymore. Whatever we thought we were investigating, whatever had led us down here, it was so much more than we had imagined. And now, all that mattered was getting out. The tunnel stretched ahead of us, blinding into darkness. The only light came from our headlamps, which flickered weakly as if they, too, were afraid. Every step echoed, making the tunnel feel like it was narrowing, closing in on us. "We just need to keep going," Alex muttered to himself, more for his own reassurance than anyone else's. His breathing was labored, and I could hear the panic rising in his voice. "There has to be another exit, right? There has to be." None of us responded. I think we were all trying to push away the same thought. What if there wasn't another way out? As we moved deeper into the tunnel, the air grew thicker, heavier. It was colder now, even colder than before, but this chill wasn't just from the temperature. It was like the very atmosphere around us had changed, turned hostile. My skin prickled, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, stopping in her tracks. Her voice was so soft, so tentative, that I almost didn't hear her. I strained to listen. At first, all I could hear was our own movement, the shuffle of feet, the rapid breaths, the pounding of my own heartbeat. But then I caught it, faint at first, but unmistakable, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps, but not ours. It was distant, echoing through the tunnels, but it was there. It was following us. We weren't alone. "We need to move faster," Greg said, picking up the pace. His voice was clipped, his calm facade cracking. He didn't need to say what we were all thinking. That sound, those footsteps, were getting closer. The growl from earlier now seemed like a warning. Something far worse was hunting us. We broke into a jog, our footsteps now echoing frantically in the tunnel, the faint tapping behind us growing louder. My lungs burned with the cold air, but fear pushed me forward. There was no room for exhaustion, no time for slowing down. Not with that thing behind us. Suddenly, Greg stopped, his flashlight darting ahead. "There." He pointed. Up ahead, the tunnel widened into another chamber, this one smaller but with several old, rusted carts scattered around. There were tracks, leading off into the distance. It looked like a storage area, maybe for transporting minerals or equipment, long abandoned. "Maybe this leads outside," Greg said, breathless, as he moved toward one of the carts. "If we can get these running, we might be able to ride them out." "Do you even know how these work?" Alex asked, his voice trembling as he glanced nervously over his shoulder. The tapping was closer now, and I could almost feel the presence of something lurking just beyond our line of sight, hidden in the darkness. "I can figure it out," Greg muttered, inspecting the mechanism. He fumbled with the rusted controls, his movements frantic. "Hurry," I urged, my heart racing. Every second felt like an eternity. As Greg worked, I glanced back toward the tunnel. My flashlight beam stretched into the blackness, revealing nothing but empty space. Yet the feeling that we were being watched had intensified, like eyes were pressing down on us from every angle. Suddenly, Sarah gasped. "Look!" At the far end of the tunnel, something shifted. I couldn't see it clearly, but there was a shadow. No, not just a shadow. A figure. Tall, dark, moving slowly toward us. It was impossibly still, but at the same time, its very presence seemed to pulse with movement, with energy. My breath caught in my throat. "What is that?" Alex whispered, his voice barely audible. None of us knew. But whatever it was getting closer and fast. Greg finally managed to get the cart moving. It lurched forward with a screech, the wheels grinding against the rusted tracks. "Get in, now," he shouted, waving us over. We scrambled into the cart, my legs almost giving out from the sheer panic. As soon as we were in, Greg shoved a lever, and the cart began to move faster, picking up speed as it rolled down the tracks. The tunnel blurred around us as the wind whipped past, cold and sharp against my skin. But the figure didn't stop. It moved with us, keeping pace, its shape distorting in the flickering light. I couldn't see its face, if it even had one, but I could feel its gaze, feel the malice radiating from it like heat. "What is that thing?" Sarah cried, clutching the side of the cart as we barreled forward. "I don't know," Greg shouted back, his hands gripping the controls, knuckles white. The cart rattled and shook as it sped down the tracks, the tunnel stretching on endlessly. The figure behind us seemed to float, its movements unnatural, like it was gliding over the ground rather than walking. The fear was all-consuming now, every rational thought drowned out by the primal need to escape. I couldn't look away from the figure. It was hypnotic, terrifying in its stillness, its silent pursuit. Then, suddenly, the cart jerked violently to one side, throwing us off balance. The tracks ahead split, and we veered off down a different tunnel, this one steeper, darker. "Hold on!" Greg yelled as we careened down the slope. The speed increased, the cart bouncing and shaking as it hurtled down the tracks. My heart pounded in my chest, the wind howling in my ears. I could barely think, barely breathe. All I could do was hold on and pray that this tunnel led somewhere, anywhere, but back to whatever that thing was. Just when I thought we might crash, the tunnel began to level out. The cart slowed slightly, the rattling subsiding as the tracks straightened. We were still moving fast, but the steep decline had passed. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, we had outrun it. But then, from the depths of the tunnel behind us, I heard it again. That growl. Louder, angrier, and much closer. We hadn't escaped. We had only made it angrier. What does it feel like when you know you've made a mistake? When the choices you've made lead you straight into the jaws of something you can't comprehend? I felt that sinking sensation deep in my chest as we barreled through the tunnel, every bump and jolt of the cart rattling my bones. We had made it angrier. And now, it was coming. The growl reverberated through the tunnel, louder with each passing second. It wasn't just a sound, it was a vibration, something that seemed to crawl through the walls and into our skin, making the very air tremble. Sarah was gripping the edge of the cart so hard I thought her fingers might snap. "We're not going to make it, are we?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the clatter of the cart on the tracks. Her eyes were wide with fear, and in that moment, I realized something. We weren't just running from a creature, we were running from the unknown, from a force that seemed to defy all logic. "I don't know," Greg replied, his voice tense. "I don't know what this thing is. I don't know what it wants." "We shouldn't have come here," Alex muttered. "We should have listened to the stories." Those stories. They had been nothing more than local myths, passed down over the years about strange happenings in the old mine. Disappearances, strange sounds, shadows that moved where they shouldn't. We had laughed them off, eager to prove ourselves, eager to be the ones who could say we discovered the truth. But now, As that growl grew louder, I realized we were the ones who had found the truth, only it wasn't something that could be explained. It wasn't something that could be written down in a report or documented with pictures. It was a nightmare made real, and we were trapped in it. The cart rattled on, the tunnel growing narrower, the air growing colder. I could see my breath now, misting in front of me, but it wasn't just the temperature. There was a presence in the air, something that made every hair on my body stand on end. It felt like we were being watched, like the walls themselves were alive, pressing in on us. Then, without warning, the cart jerked violently again, throwing us against the sides. I grabbed the edge, holding on for dear life as the wheels screeched, sparks flying from the rusted tracks. "Greg!" I shouted. "What's happening?" "We're losing control," he yelled back, his hands struggling with the lever. "The brakes aren't working." The cart was picking up speed again, hurtling down the tunnel faster than before. I could feel the gravity pulling us downward, the slope of the tunnel steepening. We were going too fast. Far too fast. Ahead of us, I could see the tunnel splitting again, two paths diverging into the darkness. But this time, there was no time to choose. The cart veered left, and I could only hope that this tunnel led somewhere, anywhere other than to our doom. As we rounded the corner, something shifted in the darkness ahead. It wasn't the creature this time, but something else, something large and metallic. My heart dropped. The track's end. Alex screamed. I looked ahead and saw it, an old mining platform, crumbling and broken, blocking the tracks. There was no way the car would stop in time. We were going to crash. "Jump!" Greg shouted. Without thinking, I leaped from the cart just as it slammed into the platform. The impact was deafening, metal on metal, with splintering into the air. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my body as I rolled to a stop, gasping for breath. I heard the others hit the ground around me, their groans and gasps of pain cutting through the darkness. But before I could check on them, I heard something else, the growl. Louder. Closer. It was here. I struggled to my feet, my body aching from the fall. The others were getting up as well, limping, clutching at their injuries, but we had no time to recover. The thing in the darkness was coming, and there was nowhere left to run. The tunnel we were in now was different. The walls were rougher, more jagged, as if it had been carved out hastily, and the air smelled damp and musty. There was no sign of the cart or the tracks. It was like we had entered a different part of the mine altogether, a part that hadn't been used in years. Decades, maybe. "This isn't right," Greg said, his voice shaking. This wasn't on the maps." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, clutching her arm where she had scraped it in the fall. Greg shook his head, his face pale. "This section of the mine, it shouldn't exist. It's not on any of the blueprints. It's not even on the old maps." A chill ran down my spine. "Then where are we?" "I don't know," Greg whispered. "But I think we've stumbled onto something we were never supposed to find." Before I could respond, I heard it again, that sound. Not the growl this time, but the soft tapping of footsteps. They echoed through the tunnel, growing louder, closer. And then, from the darkness ahead, something emerged. At first, it was just a shadow, a figure barely visible in the dim light. But as it moved closer, I could see it more clearly. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and spindly, its movements unnatural, jerky. Its face, if you could call it a face, was pale, featureless, with only deep, hollow eye sockets that seemed to stare straight through me. I froze, my body paralyzed with fear. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but my legs wouldn't move. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound deafening in my ears. "Run," Greg whispered, his voice barely a breath. But none of us moved. The figure took another step forward, its footfall echoing like a drumbeat in the silence. It tilted its head, as if studying us, as if deciding what to do with us. Then it smiled. It was the most horrifying thing I had ever seen, an unnatural, stretched grin that spread across its featureless face, too wide, too wrong. It wasn't a smile of kindness or amusement. It was a smile of hunger. "Run!" Greg shouted, louder this time. The spell broke, and we bolted. We turned and ran as fast as we could, stumbling over the uneven ground, the darkness swallowing us whole. Behind us, I could hear the creature moving, its footsteps quick, purposeful. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The terror was driving me forward, faster than I had ever run in my life. But no matter how fast we ran, the thing was faster. Suddenly, the tunnel ahead opened up into a larger chamber, and I could see a faint light, an exit, maybe salvation. But between us and that light was a massive, gaping pit. "Jump!" Greg shouted again. Without hesitation, I launched myself into the air, leaping over the pit, praying that I would make it to the other side. But as I sailed through the air, I felt something cold wrap around my ankle. That cold grip around my ankle sent a jolt of terror straight through me. It wasn't just a physical sensation, it was the overwhelming sense that something far more ancient, far more powerful than I could ever understand had grabbed hold of me. Time seemed to slow as I looked down and saw a thin, dark tendril of shadow wrapped tightly around my leg, tugging me back toward the pit below. "No!" I screamed, flailing in the air, trying to kick it off. My fingers clawed at the edge of the pit, barely grasping the rocky ledge. I could hear the others shouting, their voices filled with panic, but they were distant, muted by the sheer terror roaring in my ears. Greg was the first to reach me. He slid to the ground, grabbing hold of my wrist with both hands, his face pale but determined. "I've got you," he shouted, but even in his voice, I heard the strain. Whatever had grabbed me was strong, unnaturally strong, and it was pulling me harder with every passing second. I could feel the rocks beneath my fingers crumbling, giving way. I wasn't going to make it. "Pull!" Sarah screamed, her voice frantic as she and Alex rushed to help. Together, they grabbed my arms and pulled with all their might. I could feel the weight of the creature dragging me back, the shadow tendril tightening like a noose around my ankle, cold and suffocating. "Let go!" Greg shouted at it, as if his command would be enough to break the grip. The thing, whatever it was, didn't respond. But then, in a way that defied all reason, the tendril began to loosen. I felt the coldness recede from my ankle, and with a final tug from my friends, I was free. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, my heart hammering in my chest. Behind me, the pit seemed to writhe as though it were alive, dark shadows churning and twisting within it, but the creature was gone. I didn't know where it had gone or why it had let go, but I wasn't about to wait around to find out. "Get up," Greg urged, pulling me to my feet. "We have to keep moving." I nodded, still too shaken to speak. My ankle throbbed, the coldness lingering even though the tendril had released me, but I pushed the pain aside. The exit was close, so close I could almost taste the fresh air. Together, we scrambled toward the light. The chamber we were in was massive, the ceiling high and jagged, and I couldn't help but feel that we were being watched from the shadows. Every step I took felt like a test, as if something was waiting for the right moment to strike again. But nothing came. Finally, after what felt like hours, we reached the opening. The tunnel beyond it was narrow, barely wide enough for us to squeeze through, but I could see the faint outline of daylight beyond it. We were going to make it. One by one, we pushed through the narrow gap, crawling on our hands and knees as the rough stone scraped against our skin. I was the last to go, my heart pounding in my chest as I wriggled through the tight space. The moment I felt the cool breeze of the outside world on my face, I nearly cried from relief. And then I was out. We all were. We stumbled out into the light, collapsing onto the grass outside the mine entrance, gasping for air. We had made it. Somehow, against all odds, we had survived. But the relief was short-lived. As I lay there, staring up at the sky, trying to calm my racing heart, I felt that familiar, unnerving sensation again, the one that had haunted me since we entered the mine. The feeling of being watched. I sat up, glancing back at the entrance to the mine. It was quiet now, eerily so. The shadows inside seemed darker than they should be, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something moving, just a flicker of motion in the corner of my eye. But when I looked directly at it, there was nothing. Just darkness. "Let's get out of here," Sarah said, her voice trembling as she stood. "I don't ever want to come back to this place." None of us argued. We were done. The mine had taken enough from us. We gathered our things in silence, moving quickly, eager to put as much distance between ourselves and the entrance as possible. But as we hiked back down the trail, that feeling didn't leave me. If anything, it grew stronger. By the time we reached the base of the mountain, I couldn't shake the overwhelming sensation that something had followed us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see that pale, hollow-eyed figure looming behind me, but each time I looked, there was nothing. We made it back to town just as the sun was setting, the warm glow of the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. We didn't speak as we went our separate ways, each of us lost in our thoughts. The events of the day weighed heavily on all of us, but no one wanted to acknowledge what had happened, not yet. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the creature's smile, the way it had twisted unnaturally across its face. And that cold grip around my ankle, it haunted me, a constant reminder that something had touched me, something that wasn't human. The next morning, I received a call from Sarah. "Did you sleep?" she asked, her voice tense. "No," I replied. "You?" "Barely. I think we should talk." We met at a small diner just outside of town. Greg and Alex joined us not long after, both of them looking just as exhausted as we were. There was an unspoken tension between us, a shared understanding that something had changed, that whatever had happened in that mine wasn't over. "We need to tell someone," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "The authorities, the town, someone needs to know what's down there." But Greg shook his head. "No one's going to believe us. They'll think we're crazy." He was right. There was no way we could explain what we had seen, no way to make sense of it in a way that wouldn't make us sound insane. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had to do something. "We can't just let it stay there," Alex said quietly. "That thing, it's not natural. It doesn't belong here." We sat in silence, each of us grappling with the reality of the situation. What could we do? Who would believe us? As we sat there, lost in thought, I glanced out the window of the diner. My heart skipped a beat. There, standing in the distance, barely visible through the early morning fog, was a tall, spindly figure. Its hollow eyes stared straight at me. And it smiled. 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 Have you ever wondered what dark secrets your family might be hiding? That's the question that haunted me the day I received the old, tarnished relic from my grandmother. It seemed harmless at first, a small, ornate box that had been passed down through generations. But as soon as it entered our home, strange things began to happen. I had always known our family had a history, but I never imagined that something so simple could hold such sinister power. The box was old, made of dark wood and lined with intricate carvings that seemed to shift when you weren't looking. It came with a key, small and fragile, like it hadn't been used in decades. My grandmother had told me it was important, though she never said why. "Keep it safe," she whispered as she handed it to me, her eyes clouded with something I could only describe as fear. At first, I didn't take her seriously. How could I? It was just a box, after all. But as soon as I brought it into the house, things started to change. At night, the air in the house grew colder, even though it was the middle of summer. We heard faint whispers, like someone was speaking just beyond the walls. My wife, Sarah, brushed it off at first, telling me it was probably the wind or maybe the house settling. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. A few days later, I found the box open on the dining room table. I hadn't touched it since placing it on the shelf in my study. The key was nowhere to be found. Sarah swore she hadn't opened it either, but the carvings on the box now seemed deeper, more pronounced, almost as if they had been carved recently. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. At first, I thought it was just Sarah getting a glass of water, but when I turned over, I saw she was still fast asleep beside me. The footsteps grew louder, and then they stopped, right outside our bedroom door. I got up, my heart pounding, and opened the door. The hallway was empty, but I could feel it, that heavy, suffocating presence, like someone was standing right there, watching me. I quickly shut the door and locked it, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. The following day, we noticed more strange occurrences. Objects we hadn't touched were moving on their own. Picture frames were askew, furniture shifted slightly from its original position. And then, there was the mirror in the hallway. It began to show things that weren't there, shadows that moved when no one else was present, and figures standing just out of sight. One evening, while Sarah was in the kitchen preparing dinner, I walked past the mirror and caught a glimpse of something behind me. When I turned around, there was nothing. But in the reflection, I saw a tall, gaunt figure, standing motionless in the shadows, its eyes hollow and piercing. I froze, staring at it, my mind racing with disbelief. My heart pounded in my chest as I blinked, hoping it was just a trick of the light. But the figure remained, its gaze fixed on me. I called for Sarah, but by the time she arrived, the figure had vanished. I could see the concern in her eyes, but she tried to stay calm, telling me I must have been seeing things. I wanted to believe her, but deep down, I knew what I had seen. That night, the whispers returned, louder than before. They seemed to echo throughout the house, coming from every corner. It was as if multiple voices were speaking all at once, murmuring words I couldn't understand. Sarah and I huddled together in bed, listening in fear. Then, the whispers stopped, and for a moment, the house fell silent. Suddenly, the door to our bedroom burst open, slamming against the wall with a force that shook the room. We both jumped, and before we could react, we saw it, the same figure I had seen in the mirror, now standing in the doorway. It was taller than any human, its limbs impossibly long and thin, its skin a sickly gray color. It stared at us, unblinking, as the air around us seemed to grow colder. We couldn't move. We couldn't speak. All we could do was stare back at this creature, our bodies frozen with fear. After what felt like an eternity, it slowly raised one hand and pointed directly at the box, the family heirloom that had been the source of all this terror. The air around us grew dense, like a suffocating blanket, as the figure's bony finger hovered over the family heirloom. Sarah and I exchanged a glance of pure terror, realizing that whatever this thing was, it was connected to the relic. But the question remained, how and why? Suddenly, the figure let out a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, before vanishing into thin air. The door, which had slammed open, creaked shut on its own, leaving us in complete silence. We were too stunned to move. The temperature in the room slowly began to rise, but the tension in the air stayed thick. "We need to get rid of it," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, my throat dry. There was no denying it now. This relic, this family heirloom that had been passed down for generations, was cursed. And it had brought something with it, something dark and malevolent. The following morning, I took the heirloom out of the house. It felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in my hands, even though it was no larger than a jewelry box. I drove to the edge of town, to a place where no one would find it. I buried it deep in the ground, hoping that by separating ourselves from the object, the curse would end. But it didn't. That night, the whispers came back, louder and more insistent than ever before. They no longer felt distant. They were inside our bedroom, circling us, taunting us. And then came the scratching. At first, it was subtle, almost as if an animal was clawing at the walls. But it quickly grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was out there was trying to break in. We held each other tightly, terrified of what might happen next. The scratching stopped, only to be replaced by heavy footsteps echoing through the hall. They were slow, deliberate, getting closer with each step. We could hear them approaching the door, and then silence. I gathered my courage and got out of bed, my legs shaky. I opened the door a crack, expecting to see the figure standing there again. But the hallway was empty. I turned back towards Sarah, who looked at me with wide, fearful eyes. Then, from the darkness of the hallway, a voice, deep, gravelly, and cold, whispered, "It's not over." I slammed the door shut, my heart racing. We were trapped. No matter what we did, no matter where we went, this thing was with us. The curse hadn't been broken. Over the next few days, we tried everything. We spoke to priests, consulted psychics, and even attempted cleansing rituals we found online. But nothing worked. The entity grew more aggressive, its presence in our lives more palpable with each passing moment. At night, the whispering became unbearable. It no longer stayed confined to the walls but invaded our dreams. Each night, I dreamt of the family heirloom buried deep beneath the earth, only to see it unearthed by an unseen force, dragged back to our home. And each morning, I would wake up drenched in sweat, Sarah beside me, too afraid to sleep. One night, Sarah woke me up in a panic. Her eyes were wide, her skin pale as she pointed toward the window. "It's outside," she whispered. I turned to look, and my heart dropped. Standing just beyond the glass was the same shadowy figure we had seen that night. Its form was barely distinguishable, a dark silhouette against the moonlight, but its eyes, they glowed with an unnatural, sickly green hue. I could feel its gaze piercing through me, filling me with dread. I leaped out of bed and grabbed a nearby lamp, not knowing what I planned to do with it. As I moved toward the window, the figure melted into the darkness, leaving only an empty yard behind. "We can't stay here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need to leave." Sarah nodded, too terrified to argue. We hastily packed a few belongings and fled the house, leaving the cursed relic behind. We didn't know where we were going, but we knew we couldn't stay. We drove for hours, heading toward a town far from our own. The further we got from the house, the lighter the air felt, and for the first time in days, I thought we might actually be free. But that hope was short-lived. As we checked into a small motel, Sarah turned to me with a look of horror on her face. "Did you hear that?" she asked. I shook my head, but then I heard it too, a faint whisper, just outside the room. "No," I muttered under my breath. This can't be happening. But it was. The entity had followed us, and now it was angrier than ever. The walls of the motel room began to creak as if under immense pressure, and the air grew cold. Sarah clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin, but I didn't flinch. I was too focused on the noise, the whispering that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And then the lights flickered. A shadow passed over the room, and for a brief moment, I could see the figure standing in the corner, its hollow eyes fixed on us. "We need to end this," I said, my voice firm despite the terror gripping my heart. "We need to destroy the relic." We didn't go back to the house right away. I knew if we returned unprepared, we'd be walking right into the entity's grasp. Instead, we reached out to anyone who might have information on breaking a curse of this magnitude. We drove to nearby towns, seeking out anyone who could help. Days turned into weeks, and while the whispers followed us everywhere we went, there was a growing sense that the relic was the key. One night, we found ourselves in a small town library, poring over ancient texts and folklore. Sarah stumbled upon a book that told of relics like ours, artifacts infused with dark magic, cursed by those seeking revenge or power beyond death. According to the text, these relics were often linked to bloodlines, passed down through generations until they found their intended victim. "The curse was never meant for us," I muttered, reading aloud. "It was meant for someone in my family." I could see the realization dawn on Sarah's face. "Your great-grandfather," she whispered. "He must have done something to deserve this." The book went on to explain that the only way to break the curse was to return the relic to its place of origin and destroy it in a ritual of fire. But the ritual was dangerous, and if performed incorrectly, it could result in death, or worse. "We have no choice," I said, closing the book. "We have to go back." The drive back to the house was filled with dread. Every mile brought us closer to the source of the curse, and with it, the whispers grew louder. By the time we pulled into the driveway, the air was thick with tension. The house loomed before us, dark and foreboding, as if it had been waiting for us all along. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. The shadows seemed to shift on their own, moving in unnatural ways. We could feel the entity's presence more than ever, watching, waiting. But we couldn't turn back now. The ritual had to be completed. We made our way to the basement, where the relic had been stored. The moment we opened the door, the temperature dropped several degrees. My breath came out in white puffs as I descended the stairs, the old wooden boards creaking beneath my feet. The relic sat on a pedestal in the center of the room, just as we had left it. Its surface gleamed in the dim light, and for a moment, I could see the reflection of the entity in its polished surface, its dark figure looming behind me. Sarah and I had memorized the ritual. We had gathered the necessary ingredients, including a special oil said to bind the spirit to the relic long enough to destroy it. As I began the incantation, the house seemed to come alive. The walls groaned, the floor shook, and the shadows twisted and writhed, as if in agony. The entity was not pleased. Halfway through the ritual, the whispers became deafening. I struggled to keep my focus, reciting the ancient words as clearly as I could. Sarah stood beside me, holding the vial of oil, her hands trembling as she waited for the right moment to act. Then, just as I finished the final line of the incantation, the entity appeared. It was no longer just a shadow. It had taken form, its body a grotesque mockery of a human figure, with long, twisted limbs and hollow eyes that burned with hatred. It lunged at us, its mouth open in a silent scream, and I barely had time to react. "Now!" I shouted, and Sarah threw the oil onto the relic. The entity let out a soundless wail as it recoiled, its body convulsing in the air. I grabbed the lighter and set the relic ablaze. The flames consumed it instantly, burning with an unnatural intensity, and as the fire spread, the entity thrashed wildly, its form beginning to disintegrate. For a moment, I thought we had won. The relic was destroyed, the entity was fading, and the whispers had ceased. But then I felt a sharp, burning pain in my chest. I looked down to see a black mark spreading across my skin, radiating from where the entity had touched me. My vision blurred, and the last thing I saw before I collapsed was Sarah's face, twisted in terror as she screamed my name. When I awoke, I was in the hospital. Sarah was by my side, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "You're okay," she whispered, her voice shaky. "You're going to be okay." But I knew that wasn't true. The curse hadn't been broken, it had just transferred. The entity was gone, but its mark remained. And I could feel it, deep inside, waiting to strike again. The days following my release from the hospital were a blur. Every time I tried to sleep, I felt it lurking in the darkness, a cold presence that pressed against my chest and made it hard to breathe. Sarah tried to convince me that the worst was over, but deep down, I knew better. The curse was still alive, it had just found a new way to torment me. I began to see things. At first, it was small, shadows moving in the corner of my eye, the faint sound of whispering when I was alone. But as the days passed, the manifestations grew stronger. One night, I woke up to the feeling of hands around my throat, squeezing the life out of me. I thrashed in bed, gasping for air, only to find myself alone in the dark. But the mark on my chest told me otherwise. The entity wasn't gone. It had just taken a new form, a form that was now bound to me. Sarah noticed the changes in me almost immediately. I grew distant, withdrawn. My temper flared at the smallest provocations, and there were times when I felt like I wasn't in control of my own actions. The darkness was consuming me, little by little. One evening, after another sleepless night, I found Sarah sitting in the living room, her face pale and drawn. She held the book we had found in the small town library, flipping through the pages with trembling hands. "I think I found something," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I sat down beside her, my heart pounding. "What is it?" She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "There's a second part to the ritual, a way to transfer the curse. It's dangerous, but if we can find someone willing to take it." I felt a cold dread wash over me. "You're not serious." "I am," she replied, meeting my gaze. "There's no other way, and you know it. The curse is killing you. If we don't do something, it's only a matter of time before." Her voice trailed off, but she didn't need to finish the sentence. We both knew what was coming. The idea of transferring the curse to someone else was horrifying, but as the days passed, it became clear that I didn't have many options. The mark on my chest was spreading, its tendrils crawling up my neck and down my arms, like roots digging deeper into my flesh. The entity was growing stronger, feeding on my fear, my pain. If I didn't act soon, it would consume me entirely. We spent weeks searching for someone who might take the curse, someone desperate enough to believe in its power, someone willing to make the ultimate sacrifice. It wasn't easy. Most people laughed in our faces, dismissing us as crazed or delusional. But eventually, we found a man who claimed to be dying of a terminal illness. He had nothing left to lose, he said. If the curse wanted him, he would take it. The ritual was set for the following night. That evening, I found myself alone in the house, the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me like a boulder. I knew this was my only chance, but it felt wrong, so horribly wrong. I paced the floors, trying to push the doubts out of my mind, but they lingered like a specter, haunting my every thought. Just as the sun began to set, I heard it again, the familiar sound of whispering, growing louder and more insistent by the second. The temperature in the room dropped, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The entity was there, standing in the shadows, its form barely visible in the fading light. But this time, it wasn't angry. It didn't lunge at me or try to harm me. Instead, it stood still, watching me with hollow eyes. And then, it spoke. Not with words, but with thoughts, dark, intrusive thoughts that wormed their way into my mind. Images of death, of pain, of endless suffering. The curse wasn't just a punishment. It was a living thing, a force that thrived on despair and misery. And it wanted more. It wanted me. I staggered back, clutching my chest as the mark burned hotter than ever before. The entity was feeding on my fear, drawing strength from my panic. I knew if I didn't do something soon, it would consume me completely. The man arrived just before midnight, looking more resigned than afraid. We explained the ritual to him, though he barely seemed to listen. His eyes were distant, as if he had already accepted his fate. As I began the incantation, I could feel the entity's presence growing stronger. The shadows in the room twisted and writhed, the air thick with tension. Sarah stood beside me, holding the relic, the only thing that could bind the curse to its new host. But something went wrong. As I reached the final line of the incantation, the mark on my chest flared with unbearable heat. I cried out, stumbling backward as the entity surged toward me. It wasn't going to let go. It wanted me, and it wasn't about to settle for anyone else. The man collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, his body convulsing as the curse latched onto him. For a moment, I thought it had worked. The entity seemed to shift, its focus wavering. But then, with a terrible screech, it tore free from the man's body and returned to me, its hold stronger than ever. I fell to my knees, the pain overwhelming, as the entity whispered its final words in my mind. You cannot escape. Gape. 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 Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.